Hey everybody, and welcome to the podcast that's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast, presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee with our head coach, Chad Timmerman.
Hi, everybody.
Our CEO, not our CEO, what am I doing here?
Not today.
You've changed, Nate. Pete Morris, our product manager, but also Team Cliff Bar Racing's Pete Morris.
How's it going, guys?
Going great, man. Thanks for coming. I always like having you on.
It's really fun for me, too.
I think the people like it, too. You can join us live on YouTube and on Facebook, and we've already got some questions coming in. One of them I saw is actually very appropriate for you. So after this podcast, the questions at least that we have prepared, we will go through and answer a handful of those questions depending on the time we have. So you can join us. It's usually Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific, like it is in this case, and you can join us on there every week. So it's exciting stuff. Okay, so before we get into the questions that we have a few where it's more like clarifications on previous episodes. So the first one's from Chris. He says, "Hey guys, great podcast, great product, great team." Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
I just did my second TT and got a power result I'm super happy with. It was a 20K Mercs or retro style TT. Chad, do you want to explain what a Mercs TT is?
Yeah, it's just a regular bike. So no TT bars, no TT helmets, no deep section wheels. So basically like you'd race a road race.
Mm-hmm. In some cases, certain race organizers will really like...
they'll get real legit with it.
Yeah. They'll be like nothing deeper than like, a box section wheel.
Down tube shifters.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You literally have to dress like Axel Merckx. Yeah. Okay, so he says, "It took me just a bit under 33 minutes. I was thinking that it was really like doing an FTP test. Mm-hmm. I know that in the 8-minute test, we take 90% of the average power, and for the 20-minute test, we take 95% of the average power for those durations." He says, "For something around 30 minutes, is there any guideline for what percentage I could use from that as a potential new FTP? Thanks again for all the talk about competing on the podcast, which inspired me to get out there." So we're going to cover that specific question, but then also we realized that last week, we talked plenty of product last week, but one of the things we didn't talk about when we were talking about using outside data to pull in like an update for your FTP is how we kind of made that easier with the product itself. So we'll kind of give you a walkthrough on that. But cool. I guess first things first, Chad, when we're talking about 33-minute effort like this, what would you do?
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that anytime we estimate FTP, that's exactly what we're doing is we're estimating it. We're not measuring anything physiologically. We don't have any hard science exactly to back it up. Rather, we're saying if you can do this, then we estimate you could do this. Mm-hmm. So what you have here is a real close facsimile to that. And as it is, FTP, it is, whether you do an 8-minute test or a 20-minute test or a 30 or a 60, we're measuring a steady state. We're trying to figure out where you level off. Mm-hmm. And some people, even when they have their FTP assessment, it could be spot on, but how long they can sustain FTP can range anywhere from like 30 to 70 minutes. And that's just a matter of conditioning. Yeah. So we're working at a percentage of something that is your steady state, but how long you can hold that steady state is really anybody's guess. You can really target it closely and try to grow it. Say, I can do it for 35 minutes, and based on what I do, I'm a TT, or I need to be able to do it for 55 minutes. And you can grow that specifically, work on your stamina, add FTP. Mm-hmm. So in your case, the fact that you did this for 33 minutes, and if you did it pretty steadily, this might serve as a really good estimate, a direct estimate of your FTP. It might be about where you fall. Mm-hmm. And what I'd ask myself if I were you is, could I have extended that? If you feel like I could have ridden for 38 minutes, 40 minutes, then yeah, you probably found yourself pretty close to FTP, maybe a little under it. If you say, no, that was it, I was completely gassed, could not have gone any longer, maybe you trim it a little bit. Yeah. But in any case, you're going to be close. A 33-minute is a pretty good estimate of what you can do for 60. There might be a decrement, but again, ask yourself, could I have hung on to that? If so, you're probably in the ballpark. If not, maybe consider trimming it. But I wouldn't trim it the whole 5% like we do for a 20-minute test, because 33 minutes is substantially longer than 20 minutes when you're working that hard. Yeah. So maybe just trim it 2 or 3%. Yeah. And then see how the workouts go.
One thing that I think of with this is that in most cases, you may be a metronome, you may be perfect at this, but in most cases toward the end of any sort of
That's
TT,
a really important point.
You really pick that thing up and your average drags up. Yeah. And it's interesting because you can probably do what you were holding steady state for an hour, but did your average power really pick up for the last little bit because of a surge at the end?
And you could simply look at your power and just omit those last 2 or 3 minutes if you did that.
We were doing someone in the office was asking about an effort, and so we just lopped off the last 2 minutes because that's when it picked up, and then we took the average from before the final 2 minutes of his TT.
It's probably a better way to go about it. It's so much better to be a little under than a little over.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly right. Because what we're getting at here in the end is a training benchmark that's going to allow, ideal or better training than what you're currently having.
Yeah, though it seems like it's never a contest. You're simply trying to get a measure of your fitness. You're not trying to outdo anybody. You're not even trying to outdo yourself exactly. You're trying to see where you are.
I figure for us bike racers, we compete enough when we race. That's quite literally a competition. Yeah. So there's no need to insert the other side of things with FTP to get really hung up on that. And it's just because you have a separate competition with yourself that always inherently goes into others, because you start to set a standard and you feel like I need to chase that standard. I would chase performance, and then I would just make sure that I have a good training benchmark. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, never reduce it to your FTP test. Always look at your workouts. Always look at your performance.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the product, some cool stuff that we have, if you use TrainerRoad, you can go on there and basically once you do a ride, it will pull out PRs automatically for this sort of thing. Yep. And we pull those PRs from average power. So then if you have something like Pete and I are very capable of putting out huge normalized power for something and then not being able to back that up at all if we were to do a steady state effort. So in this case, we pull it from average power and you can see that just flat out. It will give you PRs for that. If you don't have a PR from it, you can still look through your power curve. It's really easy. You just highlight over it and it'll tell you what you did for any sort of duration. It makes it easy to pick out, like you said, for example, or like we were talking about that kick at the end. Mm-hmm. Let's say that you know that you went really 28 minutes before you started kicking up for the remaining. Mm-hmm. So that way you just go to your 28-minute power for the best and you'll see it.
And it'll be really obvious when you did kick up.
That's the other thing, yeah.
Yeah, or you could do something, you can use the interval search feature where you basically look at how long, or you basically say like for, let's just say 300 watts. How long did I hold 300 watts? And let's say you want to find every instance where you did it over 20 minutes, for example. And that would show you exactly where it is. Mm-hmm. You can create custom intervals, do a ton of stuff. So it's really easy to pull that because we really designed the ride analysis that we have on TrainerRoad around this sort of thing. Yeah. Basically, we really just want you to care about, am I getting faster or not? And that's what that proves.
Yeah.
So this is a follow-up, the next one from, way back.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Yeah. This one's from, and I apologize if I'm saying the name wrong, but Ali Khan, I believe, is the way that you would say it. You may have covered this. I'm new to TrainerRoad. I have a short period of time, 4 weeks before my first entry ride, and someone suggested I try the app and Sweet Spot Base. I'm listening to a historic podcast, and in your podcast from November 2nd, 2015, a questioner asked about a numb mouth during deep breathing when undertaking VO2 max intervals. I'm a cardiologist with an interest in sports medicine, and the answer is hypocapnia, or low CO2 in the blood as a result of increased ventilation, deep with rapid breathing. And I believe that we actually followed up on this in the next in a following episode, but this gives us kind of a unique look at it and an interesting time to kind of revisit it. Forgive me. So, says this makes your blood slightly alkaline and reduces the amount of calcium in your blood as a compensatory mechanism, which makes nerves tingly and sometimes numb. The mouth is classically affected first. If the questioner continued to force the deep, rapid breathing, they would black out eventually. Of course, this is quite difficult to do for adults, not children, especially when you're producing metabolic acids during training, because he's really talking about the pH balance of the blood, right, between the two. So the cure is to slow down the breathing or stop the deep breaths. This is a long answer, so my apologies.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, no reason to apologize at all. It says, finally, great app, great podcast, keep it up. So anyways, and he says, perhaps he'll hear this answer when he gets through 4 years worth of podcasts.
Something along those lines. I think we got kind of close.
Yeah,
we did
absolutely.
talk about hypocapnia.
Yep, absolutely. So we kind of looked into this, and we probably let our minds go a little too far in
we
terms
veered
of
way off course.
Yep.
It was so fun, though.
It was a fun meeting. But you looked into this, Chad. Kind of went. You went deep into this.
Yeah, we did a couple things. So it was the input from Ali Khan is informative, and thanks for that. But it brought up a couple questions before we even got to his input, and one of them was that because he talked about blood acidification and blood pH, or he touched on it anyway, it got us wondering. Both Jonathan and Pete produce a lot of lactate, and Pete in particular is capable of working at high levels of lactate. Jonathan as well, actually. So we thought, maybe there's something there, and I can unequivocally state, I don't know. So everything I looked into led me nowhere. Yeah. So there's if there's research out there, someone feel free to steer me toward it. But I combed quite a lot of resources and didn't find anything that didn't basically distract me and take me down another path.
Cool.
Yeah.
And if I can,
one of those paths I'll get to.
if I can interrupt really quick on this, and the reason that it was interesting is because I was like, I've never once felt any sort of numbness. And Pete was like, I've never felt it either.
Yeah.
And Nate is always telling me, you just don't go hard enough. Like, my arms go numb and I need to curl up in a ball. Like, you know what I mean?
Nate's big
So
on
that-
athletes who can go deep, and I think Nate can go deep himself.
Oh, yes. Very deep.
And I think I can too, and I think that is what differentiates Nate and me from you guys just in this respect.
Yeah.
And so what all this led me to is a little closer investigation into what's called central regulation. So if we think of the nervous system in terms of it being central and peripheral, central is the brain, peripheral is the limbs, or the muscles more specifically. This is not central versus, we're not talking central about the cardiac muscle. We're talking about the central nervous system, so the CNS. We're also, and this kind of seems like we're splitting hairs or maybe starting to argue semantics, but we're really not. This is not exactly the central governor. It's more central regulation, and there is an important distinction between the two. The central governor, if you've ever read Tim Noakes, he's the one who put it out there, and I believe stands pretty heartily behind it, talks about how our experiences shape our limitations. So what we gain from experience imprints in a manner of speaking on our brain and then affects what we can do later on. So it's not a feedback system, it's feed forward. The brain dictates. Whereas central regulation integrates all parts of our peripheral nervous system and our central nervous system, and it creates a response to fatigue using feedback. So afferent feedback is how it's termed. So our muscles tell our brain something, and our brain affects action accordingly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so the difference is simply a distinction between a feed-forward system and a feedback system.
Right.
Feedback being, I think, where the real science, where the real gets, or the real information lies.
Cool.
So the central governor it breaks down in a number of ways. So if this is just a feed-forward system and we're basing it on experience, well, first it assumes or implies that we have to accumulate that experience. So that's something that's always tortured me if I try to think about this too much. But then there are a lot of studies that are really interesting that says this has got to be a feedback system. I mean, if we're gonna pin a lot of responsibility on the brain, it's got to be feedback. And there's just so many instances of it. And I shared several actually of the more I want to share more of the more interesting ones that I looked at. And one of them was from 2014, done by Rossman, where he used integrated electromyography. So actually looked into the muscle, looked at the electrical activity going on in the muscle, and determined that the more mass that's involved, the more muscle mass that contributes to the joint action, to whatever we're doing, the less tolerance we have for fatigue. And he did this by doing single leg extensions and double leg extensions. So when you extend one leg, say you can push and you fail at 20 reps. But when you try to do both legs at the same time, it comes to be more like 12 or 14. And these are just example numbers, not exact numbers. But the point is, if you do one leg at a time, you can achieve much more work, which says it's not a muscular limitation, that rather it's a central limitation. Yeah. Something from your brain is saying there's too much muscle in action right now. I'm going to slow you down a little sooner to prevent self-harm.
It seems really logical.
Yeah,
you know?
It seems so. And then how about, we've talked about this a number of times, the carbohydrate mouth rinse, where athletes doing a time trial simply swish carbohydrate and spit it out. And I know a little glucose will get taken up in the mouth itself, but not enough to measurably affect performance, and certainly not as quickly as the response that comes from tasting something sweet.
That's kind of like your body almost like getting ahead of itself, saying like, hey, this is coming.
We're good.
I can pick it up.
That's exactly it. I mean, probably not exactly scientifically, but I mean, that's what we're describing. And then 2012, just a study in England. I couldn't, it was referenced in something else and I couldn't find the specific link to it. So, but it's one that I've seen a few times, and when they had time trials performed, the same group of riders did time trials in 72 degrees Fahrenheit and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking about room temperature and then pretty hot. And they finished the time trials with the same core temperature, but differences in distance and lower power for the hotter time trial. Okay, that's not too surprising.
Right.
But then they did it at a supposed 79 degrees Fahrenheit, when in fact it was 90 degrees.
So they told the testers it was 79.
Exactly, and those differences disappeared.
That's amazing,
right? So it's like, okay, it's not hot. I can go hard.
I like that. It's not cold. It's not hot. It just is what it is. Cool.
So the takeaway from this, and this is kind of a side note, but central governor or central regulation, feed forward or feedback, who really cares? In this case, it just makes a real strong case for heat acclimation or heat acclimatization, because it has an impact beyond the physiological.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point with the heat, acclimation. I feel like my body, yes, we've talked before about how like, it learns to sweat, but also my mind learns to be okay with cooking. And that's like with that feeling. Yeah. And at first, when you're not used to it, every year and you get into your first hot race, you're like, I'm going to burn up.
When we did Carson off-road,
we
had been exposed to no heat. I mean, we literally had snow 2 days prior. They were plowing the roads. And then we go out in 90 degrees and have to ride up a hill early morning, no shade, no wind.
Yes.
And we all just baked.
Yeah. And I think that, like you said, that's the interesting thing, even though you had, and some people even showed up to that race. And I'm thinking a lot of the pro racers, they had already had hot races and they're like, yeah, it was fine.
Yeah.
It was fine.
I didn't notice.
But for us that hadn't been used to that, that's super interesting.
And there's obviously some physiology there too. I mean, if they've done any time in the heat or maybe even acclimated in a sauna, whatever, they probably had greater plasma, could cool better.
Right.
But that's not all that's going on. And then to drive this point even further, they did another study in which time trialists in front of a screen had optic input, and the screen moved at different speeds. So you would think that so they altered what they call the optic flow and did the same amount of work, but it affected the rate of perceived exertion. And what's a bit paradoxical about this is that the slower the speed, the less the perceived exertion.
Interesting.
You would think the faster the speed, but for whatever reason, they associated slower speeds with less work, and their RPE went down.
I think that's why having power data is so good with that, like in seeing a manifestation of your effort. You know what I mean?
You know exactly. That's work right there. That's not speed. That's not anything other than me
work.
Pushing pedals.
And it's a clear indication of it. Some days, when you swear your power meter's broken, it can be a little bad. when you feel not so fast, but.
So this all led me to a resource I've referred to many times. I got a man by the name of Samuel Marcora, who's an exercise physiologist at the University of Kent. And he's more about the conscious brain affecting perceived exertion. So this is not subconscious. This isn't out of our hands. This is conscious. These are things we choose. So basically what he puts out there is that athletes think they've reached a maximum effort level. They actually acknowledge that. So conscious decision making actually enters the process at this point. We're not just victims of whatever our brain dictates or whatever the afferent feedback feeds our brain, and then our brain dictates. Rather, we're deciding this hurts, I quit. Yep. So this is why I've talked many times in my workout texts and previous podcasts about there being a distinct difference between quitting and failing. Quitting is a choice. Failure, not so much.
Yeah.
And this is also, he kind of pointed that out. Ali Khan pointed out how quite difficult to do for adults, not children, in terms of blacking out. Yeah. And that's fully accurate, because you consider adults have learned a lot. We've learned what hurts. We've learned, when we start to push so hard that it becomes so miserable we can't abide it anymore. Kids don't really have that governor. I probably shouldn't use that word, but they don't really have that sort of restraint. They can push themselves to the point of passing out.
Yep. Yeah.
Far more likely for them to do it than for adults to do it.
I actually remember like my first mile run when I was a kid. And I didn't know that you were supposed to over-dramatize it. I didn't know anything like that. I just thought you were supposed to run really fast the whole time.
As hard as you could until you couldn't anymore.
Yeah, and it was like my fastest mile time for years, because after that, then I realized like, what I did that right there was really hard, really difficult, everything else, because everybody else around me was saying that, right? Yeah. I didn't know that there were limits.
They're untarnished. I mean, we're unconditioned as youngsters. I think back, and I used to torture my mother by crying myself into a blackout as an infant. I would cry, not take a breath, and I would pass out. How terrifying is that for her?
Your poor mom.
But as a kid, I didn't realize if I keep on crying, I'm eventually going to pass out.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've learned that lesson since then, because I don't do it anymore. No, some movies, I mean, it really gets me. I don't pass out. And then yet another study they used, and this one I'm really fascinated with. It was an avatar study. So they have a screen or some sort of visual representation where you're racing yourself. And they tell you, we're going to pitch you up against your best ever performance. You should be able to do this. Best ever, and I'm guessing within close proximity. This is not like 10 years ago you did this. It's probably something recent.
Right.
I mean, what they did is without telling them, they actually bumped up the avatar's performance 1%. And what did the riders do?
They just did it.
They did it. They matched. They actually outdid their best ever performance. That in and of itself is really interesting. But then Indiana University did the same thing, but they bumped it up 2%. Athletes did it. they went 2% faster. But there's where it really gets interesting is they told them the first time we deceived you, we actually made you work 2% faster.
Yeah.
And they had them do it again. And they matched it because now they know I can do that. It's like a conscious recognition. The wall of fatigue has been pushed back just a little bit.
Yep.
And they did it again.
I feel like, once again, like with power data, having that sort of a thing, that's why it can be really helpful. Like, especially on days where you have variable conditions outside. Like, let's say you're going to do a TT and one day it's windy, one day it isn't. It's always really defeating to hold yourself against a past time if the conditions aren't ideal.
Sure. Yeah.
But then when you have power and it's something totally you can control, right? It's all within that. And you say, look, like, I know this hurts really bad, but last week I did 300 watts up this.
Absolutely.
And I can do that.
And
I need to remember I can do that.
That's why workouts progress.
Yeah.
I mean, we start you here and then we show you, I can do that. So now we're going to see if you can do more. You do more and your confidence just builds along with your physiology, but your brain is learning this whole time.
That's why it's so important to have like a structured plan that's really laid out properly like that progresses you. Because it's super easy to fall back into doing the same workouts over and over.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
And it's just a fun way to progress athletes in terms of their capabilities, both physiologically and psychologically. So there's a whole lot of systems that measure fatigue, and there's so much theory out there, and it's interesting stuff. But how much of it actually benefits us as athletes? We don't really need to know this stuff in great depth, but it is interesting to learn how they complement one another. And in terms of complementing each other, there's one called the complex systems model of fatigue that kind of pushes puts all this stuff together. And that's where it gets really interesting because that's the most likely. And it's not any one thing. It's going to be a combination of a lot of things, a complex system. And this includes the energy depletion model, where basically you just run your muscles dry. So how could you possibly do more work? Although you can't really run your muscles dry because that basically equates to death. There's the neuromuscular fatigue model, muscle trauma model, biomechanical model, et cetera. So there's a lot of them. But what we see is that regardless of the model, is long efforts cause local fatigue. So it's like, even if we can't accept it or wrap our brain around it or we've done it before, the fatigue happens because basically we get tired of pain.
Oh, yeah.
So our pain tolerance at some point reaches a limit. And what's really interesting is how easily we can shift that limit a little bit. Like if you've been in the saddle for a couple hours and you just get up and stand for a few minutes, that pain abates enough so that you're kind of back in it for a little while. So it's just a little break from the pain. You didn't change the stress on the muscles. I mean, we talk about getting out of the saddle, how it's a little different, it recruits muscles a little differently. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just a break from that gnawing pain that you've been enduring for the last couple of hours.
I completely agree. I felt that same thing. It's just a shift in pain. Yeah.
And I think moving the pain around a little bit.
So this led me to think about how when you watch Grand Tours and they take those sticky bottles, I mean, they're not really going to benefit of getting pulled along by the car, towed for the 5 seconds that they hang onto the bottle. Right. But it does alleviate a little bit of that pressure on the muscles, a little bit of that pain for just long enough for them to gain something from it.
Yes.
It's not going to change their race.
That 5 second mental break.
Yeah.
Right?
Like, it actually could change a race. I mean, you do enough of them. But in any case, it may change the next 5 minutes.
We've seen that before.
Yes, we have.
Some ultra sticky bottles,
And then this is also a little off topic, but it is attributable to why endurance athletes are so smart. And I know it sounds like we're patting ourselves on the back here, but the fact is we challenge ourselves mentally for hours and hours trying to suppress the feelings or the urge to avoid pain.
Oh yeah.
We compartmentalize it. We tolerate it. We grow our pain tolerance, and that takes mental capacity.
Yes.
That takes a strong brain, if you'll forgive that.
I completely agree with that. I think, and once again, not to like pat ourselves on the back or anything else, but anybody that's listening to this, the mental gymnastics that you do when you're in the middle of like a hard effort or a long race or you're pushing really hard.
Yes.
You're incredibly capable of bargaining with yourself or managing the situation that's going on when your receptors are all throughout your body are like stop.
Yep.
And you're just saying, I don't know how you bargain with yourself.
You're mentally coping.
You're making it happen.
And this is what's leading me to, and this was not my intention with this, but it's leading me to plug interval training.
Yeah.
And there's one study in particular, but there are a number of studies that show how beneficial interval training is. But in particular, we can see rapid adaptation, not really adaptation on a physiological level, more a psychological one that improves performance after just 4 interval sessions. After just a small handful of interval sessions, there's no way the physiology has caught up with the stress that we just subjected ourselves to. But psychologically, absolutely. And it's for this reason that I like to start riders with short VO2 max intervals and then grow the intervals. Because you can probably gut out 2 and 3 minute intervals right now, but it'd be such a miserable undertaking. Why not bolster an athlete's belief in himself or herself, start him with 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, grow it up to a point where going into the workout, you're not dreading it. You're like, no, I can do this. Yep. I just did 2-minute ones last week, and now I'm doing 2-minute 30 seconds. I can definitely do another 30 seconds.
Yeah, that's a super good point. Man, thinking on this too with like the interval training, I wonder how sticky that is. And I wonder, like, once again, your brain knows you've been able to do it, because I've seen some riders come back years after, like, they haven't been training. They don't have the physical capability they once did. Yeah. And we go up climbs, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, this person should probably be taking a break.
Able to do this.
Like, be stopping and just resting.
Sure.
But it's like they're so used, they still have that still is cemented in their brain to be like, I'm okay with this much pain.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And they're
I've
able
done
to
it
go
before.
through it.
I know I can do it. You know, it's going to hurt in terms of discomfort, but it's not going to hurt in terms of damaging myself.
Right. Yeah, it's super interesting to see.
Yeah. So one of the notes on the notes here is it was one of you, John and Pete, noted that not everybody experiences their limits in the same way. Exactly. It's exactly what I'm saying.
Yep.
And not everybody has the ability to push to legitimate failure for whatever reason.
Yep. Yeah.
So I don't.
You were mentioning this, Pete, when you were talking about ramp tests and your failure point in ramp tests. Can you explain what happens when you get to a failure point in a ramp test? Because I think it's different than what a lot of people experience.
So what we were talking about, what John and I were saying that I've never gone to complete muscle failure, or that for some reason that's not how my body works. Yeah. But definitely for me, it's more of a brain kind of slow down where everything starts happening slower, and you're breaking off small chunks of time, and just dealing with a super small amount of time.
Your focus just gets tighter and tighter and tighter.
And tighter and tighter. And it feels awful, like it always does, but that's the only, for whatever reason, I can't choose to look at it another way. That's just what happens to me when I'm deep into something like that. And it happens in races too. It happens, you just start breaking it down as small as I possibly can. It's like, make it to the next corner, make it to the next, get on the wheel.
But that's one of your strengths, and that's what you play. You know, you can reach a really high level of discomfort and hang on to that for quite some time, which is...
Yep.
And the interesting part about that too is, I like, another way to phrase it is, I would say that, like, rather than your muscles giving out, your brain says, like, you make your brain conscious decision to say, I'm done. Right.
So I can't go any harder, but I can stay here.
Yep.
So you can tolerate it. You just can't push beyond it.
Yeah.
Correct? Which is really interesting.
And that defines my experience too. When I have an effort where I'm going all out, my brain is the one that gives up, not my legs, not my heart, not my lungs. Very rarely. There are times when I feel like, okay, I'm just not up to snuff physically in one respect or another.
So you're like psychologically pulling the pin. And when we train, we learn how to, just postpone that a little bit at a time. And
pin in a little longer.
Yeah, exactly. Like with ramp tests, when I'm going through, it's almost like when I finish, there is some physical relief, but for me, when I finish a ramp test, it's almost entirely psychological relief. Yeah. I feel like I'm so glad to be out of that battlefield where I was just absolutely abusing myself, saying like, nope, keep going. My muscles weren't giving up, but my brain was getting so tired of dealing with that. Yep. And it reached.
We just train ourselves to tolerate pain.
Yeah.
Getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what training is, so much of it.
Yeah, it's awesome. Andy's question is, I feel like this is really interesting and applicable to a lot of our experience here. Anybody that's a cyclist. I'm not sure if this has been discussed before, but what would provide more training benefit? Barely hanging on to a fast group or riding on the front of a slower group? Super good question. The age-old wisdom seems to be, if you want to get faster, ride with a fast group. However, it seems there could be something said for being on the front end of a slower group doing the majority of the work. I ask because sometimes I join large group ride that has an A and B group option. The A's average 20 miles per hour plus, emphasis on the plus, while the B's average 17 to 18 miles an hour. I often find myself stuck in the middle, averaging somewhere between 18 to 20 miles an hour on each of these rides, or I assume when he's behind the fast guys. I've ridden with both groups and find it a struggle to stay in contact with the A's while riding with the B's. I'm usually on the front, or on occasion off the front with a few other riders.
Yeah, welcome to the world of upgrading.
Yep.
Happens over and over and over.
There needs to be a B plus, right? Yeah. Or an A minus. I feel like this one really depends on your objectives. There's the psychological aspect of a group ride where you may just want that experience, the social aspect of it, the training benefit that you get from dealing with having to deal with somebody else. There's no interval structure necessarily. Somebody else is just going to throw the random structure at you all the time. So
The benefits of learning to ride in a group.
So when I do a group ride, I have objectives, and it's not to me that I just don't go out and ride at times too, but really, I see this as depending or which choice to do, sit on the front and do a lot of work or barely hang on. That really depends on your objectives and your abilities. Like thinking of being on the front of the slower group, you know, if you need more time at threshold around steady state, right? That's like a good option to do that.
Yeah, just sit up front and drive the field.
Yeah. I feel like you just have to like be careful to maintain like proper etiquette, right?
Yeah. And I think if you're one of the fast people in the group, then it's really up to you to be nice and kind and do the right things.
Yeah,
you
not
don't
to be a hero.
Right.
Yeah.
You're not cracking whips and just smashing the field.
Be an adult, yeah.
Yeah, don't be the guy that's riding at the front of the slower group and then riding at 21 or 22 and getting frustrated because people can't hold your wheel. You know, you want to ride at the appropriate pace. So there's that for sure. But then at the back of the last group, I feel like that's like a great way to sharpen the blade. We do that every week.
That's just how you get faster.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's the same thing we were just talking about. You just hang on a little longer, you know. And every time you do that, you're pushed out of your comfort zone, and you're with riders who are probably better pack handlers, better tactics. So you also learn from the fast guys too.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of this in terms of triathlon. I mean, you want to be swimming with the best swimmers, running with the best runners, riding with best riders, even if you don't fall into any of those groups. But by being immersed in those groups, chasing those wheels, trying to hang on to those paces, the improvement comes, I won't say more quickly, but it's all but guaranteed.
That's a great example if you look at triathlon, because the top triathletes have runners, just runners, and they train with that runner. And when they do their track workouts, they're trying to hold on to that runner,
They
right?
train with runners.
Yep.
Dedicated
and then
runners.
On the swim, they train with dedicated swimmers. On the bike, they train with dedicated fast cyclists. You know what I mean? So
The best ones do.
Yeah, exactly right. And I feel like there's something to be said for, you know, overreaching, and there's a certain danger there for sure when you're always trying to hold with somebody that's faster, but it has its time and place, and you just have to work it in, you know, whether it's
you
the
don't do it all the
weekend
time.
runs.
You don't go out there and just thrash yourself every single time and beat yourself up mentally.
Right. But it has its place for sure. And I think that the one thing I've learned dangling off of the back of fast groups is efficiency. Like you really learn how to, because you only have a few cards in that deck while others may have more.
And tenacity.
Oh yeah.
You sit back there and suffer and just refuse to quit.
How many times have you felt like I'm completely done? But then in retrospect, you end up actually hanging on somehow. And you're like, and I feel like that's a big mental strength.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, how much does that mentally buoy you too?
Yes.
Just having hung in there. I used to do it on here in Reno, we have Wednesday night runs with Eclipse, or we did back when I was trying to be a duathlete. And I started with those guys and just, there they go. That's it.
Yeah.
But every week that I showed up, I was doing other training, obviously, but every week I showed up, I was a little closer to the group. And then it got to a point where they would get back to Eclipse at the end of the run, and I'd get back several minutes later. It got to a point where I was only getting back a couple minutes later. And I still wasn't running with them, but I was narrowing the margin, and it was so encouraging.
Yeah. There are plenty of times, too, where I've gotten dropped, but then I've told myself, well, now it's TT time. Now this is you just working, and you end up catching back up again. Yeah. You know, so I mean, if you're really looking at the best benefit in terms of performance, I would say ride with the faster group.
Yeah. Long term, definitely the faster group's going to get you further in the long run.
Absolutely.
Yep. The only situation where I would say that you would want to ride on the front of the slower is, like I said, if you have like a goal for like a really long steady state TT, and that's what you're really working for, that sort of stuff.
Or you just need to bolster your ego.
Sure. Yeah.
Every once in a while, you
See, people downgrade from the A's to the B's, and I just can't wrap my mind around that. I think once you're an A, you're forever an A. Once you're a Cat 1, you're forever Cat 1.
Yeah. The only thing I guess that I would say too is if you are that steady state athlete, and let's say you're going for a time trial, if all your workouts throughout the week are steady state, then still go with a fast group on the weekend, because that's just mixes in something unique and different that can push your limits in different ways and maybe enable you to reach higher levels of performance, even with a steady state effort.
Yeah, it's informative when you're not making the calls, when you simply have to respond. I mean, it's racing. That's how racing goes. Yeah.
It's kind of exciting. Makes me excited for Saturday drop ride that we have here every weekend.
Yeah, it's a good time.
Stefan says, thanks for the awesome podcast and software. Just wanted to know how to deal with my race schedule. Currently, I'm doing a Half-Ironman, or the Half-Ironman mid-volume plan, ending with 70.3 Slovenia in mid-September. 3 weeks before that, I have an Olympic distance race scheduled. How should I deal with a few days after the Olympic distance, as he's getting ready to ramp up once again, just 3 weeks later into the 70.3 in Slovenia? He says, I mean, I know myself. If I got a good day, I'm going for it all out. He says, I just don't know how to structure the next few days of training after the event. So any suggestions? And first things first, this is a really common sort of scenario to see. You do an Olympic triathlon and it reminds you of what high pace is. And it's a good thing. It's race experience. It's slightly shorter, so it doesn't fatigue you as much as a full 70.3. It allows you to get back to training once again.
It in and of itself is good training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you even recommend this throughout the triathlon plans that people should organize these races in like this, right?
Basically a test race.
Yeah.
So a B priority sort of event, even if it doesn't exactly align with the demands of the event you're doing. In this case, a half-Ironman versus an Ironman, or an international versus a half. Close enough. You're going to be able to learn a fair amount.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is common. What should they do a few days after that sort of a race?
If you ideally you have previous experience and you've done this before and you know how you recover after something like that, and whether or not you can carry that level of fatigue or if it'll boost you going into what comes next. Is it 3 weeks later?
Yeah, 3 weeks later. Yep.
Yeah. So, but if you don't have that previous experience, you gotta wing it. You gotta figure it out.
Yep.
And there's really, I'm trying to get away from using the term trial and error, because error implies you did something wrong, whereas it's more about accumulating experience. As long as you learn from it, there's no wrong to that. You're benefiting.
Yeah, you're always tidying up your process.
Exactly.
And,
You're just learning more about yourself as an athlete and building that experience base. So that might be what you have to do here. I mean, you can say, I'm carrying a whole lot of fatigue into this. So I'm going to do this race, and then I'm going to recover for a week, and then I'm going to sharpen for 2 weeks. You can say, I feel great coming out of it. I'm going to train all the way up to it and taper for 3 days. I mean, it's really hard to tell you what to do with not a heck of a lot of information. You've got far more than I do. So based on what you've seen in the past, you're going to have to do a little bit of asking yourself the right questions.
I feel like the principle behind it is like training has to feel good at some point between the two events, right?
That's a point I wanted to make too, is that so many people just beat themselves up workout after workout after workout. And if you're never feeling good, if you're never getting to a point where the workouts themselves are satisfying and you feel on top of it, then you're basically overtraining all the time. You should get to a point where you feel in charge of your training, where you don't dread the workouts, but you look forward to them.
Yeah, excitement for workouts, right?
Yeah, exactly. You should have the fitness. The fitness should come up, such that you become more and more capable. And then, of course, we knock you back down by reassessing you and making everything harder again. But the fact is, you reached a point where you felt good about things, and training was fun, and going out and doing Saturday rides and riding with your pals is fun, and racing is fun. If you don't ever get there, you're blowing it somewhere.
This is why you'll see in the specialty phase on most of our plans, we don't have ramp tests scheduled 3 weeks before your event, right?
Yeah,
we have you training at the level that you're at, and what we really want you is to feel that excitement. In other words, and what that's really getting at physiologically, we're talking about your strength is meet for the demands of whatever, the race will be or whatever the training is. And if at some point in between that Olympic and that half distance race, you don't feel this, then this is a learning experience where next time you can incorporate more rest. Maybe that rest is right after the Olympic distance event, something like that. But that's kind of the point that you want to get to, is you want to feel like I'm really doing well. 3 weeks, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of time to increase fitness between the events,
Very
right? That's
unlikely.
not the goal.
Yeah, in fact, the last little bump in fitness you're likely to get will be that race.
Exactly.
So gut yourself, go for it, and then just decide how much recovery is going to be required afterward to get you back on track.
Yep.
And then it's really time to sharpen. I mean, this is all gearing up for a half.
Yep.
So you probably won't need a crazy long taper. You probably won't need a full 2 weeks of taper. So you might be able to get some more training in there, but you got to be careful, because it's not going to be the sort of training that's going to give you anything that's going to manifest on race day.
Yeah.
So at that point, I mean, even if you don't need that long of a taper, I would start to think in terms of tapering. Maybe you don't go, maybe you don't diminish your training load as much as you would with only 3 days to go, but you can start to kind of dial things back. Obviously, the intensity stays there, but the volume of work will diminish.
Looking at, I'm sure there's somebody out there going like, I'm doing a full distance. Same scenario, but doing a full distance try. What would you, or how would that change?
Full distance triathlons typically entail more training, and more training entails more fatigue. So to shed more fatigue, it requires a longer taper. So chances are, even if you could get by with a reasonable race performance with a 5-day taper, maybe you actually do need a 10-day taper. And as always, it depends what else is going on. I mean, maybe work is particularly stressful, family life is stressful, whatever. But if you're carrying a high training load, even with all those things aside, and you recognize there's a lot of fatigue in there, that fatigue has to be dismantled. You know, you have to get rid of some of it over time and bring yourself to race day feeling good about it. And that can take a number of days if you're dealing with a whole lot of fatigue and a whole lot of a high training load.
Yeah, 100%.
So I'd count on at least a week, maybe closer to 10, 14 days.
You'll see top triathletes constantly talking about how they are refining this process.
Yeah.
Oh, always.
Always.
It's a constant process.
Yeah, it's never like you've locked in and it's perfect, because your body also changes as well. I can't remember the name of the top triathlete that I'm thinking of, but top performer. And he was saying that I used to do extremely well with coming in with no taper. And I just kind of kept things strong all the way through to full distance events. But that had changed for him. And he found that for some reason, it's not working, right? Yeah. And so once again, I like how you mentioned the fact of trial and error versus accumulating experience. Accumulating experience should give you a barometer, or be a barometer of exactly how you're responding to this now, because that could change. And it doesn't mean that you're a worse athlete. Yeah. It just means that you respond differently
Different
now.
lead-ins, different stresses,
Yeah, diligent note-taking. Honestly, if you want to really benefit from your experience, don't expect to remember all this. You're going to have to make notes. You've got to record, why you think this is working for you right now. All the minutia that we don't, we're actually going to get to that too. We've got some recovery devices that we're kicking around. So we'll talk more on that in a bit.
Yeah. And we should learn from Formula One or MotoGP teams in this case. Like when they go to Circuit of the Americas or Yas Marina or any of these like amazing places that you see, they have so many notes on everything, and they have all the data from every aspect of the performance, every lap along the way, and they can understand that data. Now, as a cyclist or a triathlete, you're kind of the same, because you have every second along the way measures of your performance, right? And that's why it's so important to have that data, but also to fill it in. And they have staff on these teams, their entire job is just to basically sum up and organize and fully own the understanding of how tires performed at Circuit of the Americas or something like that, right? Yeah. And they have everything kind of broken down like that. And if you can have notes on that sort of thing, that's really helpful. Like I do that, for example, and it sounds silly. So I have in my phone, I have just using the notes app, I have different races, and every time I just have the name of the race, and that's the main thing. So then I can search and find it, and it's pretty easy to do. And then inside the cabinet in my garage where I keep my helmets and shoes and all that stuff on the door, I have, with a Sharpie, I have a chart that's down there, and I write down my settings and the date on every one of those as well.
Yeah, that's more important objective data. I mean, power isn't everything. No, I mean, it's a big thing, but it's not the only thing. Yeah,
and it really helps me understand the process of performance that I had, or the level of performance that I had at a previous event and what I did to get there. So it's just hugely important. I think it can help. And we'll have an upcoming article, actually. We have a number of them for just cyclists in general, but multi-sport articles are coming. If you go to the TrainerRoad Help Center, and you can just Google that, or you can go on to there, and it's and you can find it on TrainerRoad.com. You don't have to be a member to see this sort of stuff. And we actually have a number of articles in the training questions area where you can see how to taper for events, how to adjust your training plan, how to fit these things in. Shout out to, at times he's filled in before, Bryce, producer Bryce here, who's our community manager. He worked really hard on those. So he has some multi-sport ones coming up with advice like what you've laid out here. Awesome. So it'll be really helpful. Scott says, I'm racing the Boulder 70.3 as a relay. That's my type of triathlon. As long as I'm not swimming.
Bike only, 40K bike. I'm done.
Here we go. As a relay on August 3rd, and it's now June 16th. I'm responsible, or it's really June 20th for us. He says, I'm responsible for the bike leg, and I pre-rode 36 miles of the course this week. This is really funny. I found that I have severe problems with pacing. I tend to go hard intermittently and early.
We all do.
You're a biker.
Go out, blow up. Go out, blow up.
I like this one too, because it's not, I tend to go hard intermittently late. Like nobody chooses to do that, right? You just go hard and you get really tired, and then you go hard again and you get really tired, and then your hard just starts to kind of go down, right?
Your heart isn't hard anymore.
Yep. He says, I also experienced lower back cramping after about an hour and 45 minutes, which made it impossible to put out power later on despite feeling otherwise good. So he's formulated a solution. Part 1, begin tweaking my position on the trainer. Take notes. We just talked about that. And stay in the aero position full time when he's talking about training, right? Part 2, create a custom TrainerRoad workout based on a best bike split plan for the race course and begin doing it. So he says, are these good solutions? How often should I do the full 2.5-hour race plan on the trainer? What else should I try? And he says, by the way, I love the podcast and keep up the good work. So I think the first point is great. I think the second point is not very great. And we can go into to that sort of thing. But first thing, I'm tweaking the position on the trainer, taking notes, staying in the aero position full time. That's one of the huge helps of the trainer. If you're comfortable on the trainer, then you're going to be comfortable out there on race
Very
day.
probably.
Yeah. And I think that there's something to be said in some regard, like, for most cyclists, they don't spend much time on the TT bike at all. They just want to raise performance in general, and then they'll suffer through the bike leg.
On the day, they'll just figure it out.
That's what you've done plenty of times, right, Pete? Yeah. But I think that it's not... in this case, if this is really like your main goal, I would spend more time on the trainer in the aero position, figuring that sort of thing out. So I think that's good. Staying in the aero position full time. We've talked about that before. You probably want to ease your way into it, right, Chad?
Yeah, I would do it incrementally. So, start with particular durations and then grow those durations. And they don't have to be specific either. You can't just say, or you don't have to necessarily say, I'm going to do 3-minute increments today, and the next time I'm going to do 3:30s and 3:40s and 3:50s, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever. You can just say, I'm going to stay until I'm uncomfortable, and do that, and then take a look at how long you manage to sustain that. Try to grow that. What I don't want is for athletes just to stay in the position at all costs. So many sacrifice power because they just got to stay aero, man. I got to stay aero. When if they could just give themselves a brief break from that aerodynamic position, just like we talked about,
move the
getting
pain
out
around.
of the saddle. Exactly. Float that pain for a second. Come back to it, and then manage it for longer than you would have otherwise.
I think that's a great idea.
Yep.
Yeah. Now on replicating courses, so that's
Such
something.
a common tendency, and it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes
Logically, it makes sense.
Yeah, if I can get really good at doing a course simulation, I should be really good at the course. But where's the training benefit in that? And a lot of the times, races just run us down and break us, so that we're kind of useless for the next few days. So why would you want to do that in a workout? So there is something to be gained in that. I can do it. I've done it, but you can kind of figure that out with shorter efforts. If you can do an hour and a half at a particular pace, you probably don't have to trim it too much to make that 2.5 hours or 3 hours. And if you can do 5 weeks out, hour and a half at that pace, then in 5 weeks, you can probably maintain that same pace for the full 2.5 hours. So you don't necessarily have to subject yourself to a really specific simulation so much as train your fitness. Don't train specifically for a course.
Yeah, have you done much of that, Pete, or what?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. At the beginning, I used to try to race the course or train the course I was going to be using, and then at some point it shifts, and you realize you have to train to be better on that course, right? Like there's something that I need to change about me to be better on that course. So then you kind of tackle intervals or whatever, like a hilly crit. I'll do a lot of 30-second or 15-second hard efforts, which isn't me finding a loop in a neighborhood and riding a hill a bunch of times. No, it's real designated time domains of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off.
Sure.
And that's what's going to change my physiology better and faster for the race.
And you have the fitness, so when you get to the race, you'll be able to apply that fitness. Then it just comes down to strategy and tactics, and not having mechanicals and choosing the right wheels and et cetera.
I think you'll see much better performance if you decouple those two things and treat them separately, because then you have full focus on training energy systems, which are going to decide your performance level.
Yep.
And then you have the other side of things where you can really, because you can pick up a course very quickly. Like you don't need to ride it every day, even though you don't need to recreate it and then simulate it. And in many cases, what I find with that is a lot of the time, let's say that you have a course and you've replicated it and it's kind of hilly, that sort of a thing. It's really easy to get into bad habits if you ride that course all the time. And what I mean by that is bad pacing. It's easy to get to the point where you push really hard on the climbs and then you don't push hard otherwise. But in your training, if you're constantly focusing on just, hitting your marks with your training, that's going to be increasing your ability to put out X power for Y time, right? And you're just going to continue doing that. And that is going to build a better performer.
Yeah, and the fitness is what matters most. The course characteristics, there's a big climb on this course, for instance. Well, if you have high fitness, you'll still be able to manage that, or you'll be able to manage that climb regardless of whether or not you've actually done that climb.
Oh, yeah.
So build the fitness, don't sweat the course details. And I'm not trying to say that the course details don't matter. If you know there's a long climb, then you best be good at long climbs. Right. If you know there's short, hard, punchy climbs, you need to practice those. But you don't need to do a direct simulation of the course.
And I think he did a good job, 8 weeks beforehand riding a portion of the course. Like that's
Absolutely.
a That's a great way to do it.
Proper recon.
That's proper reconning, right? Where
Yeah.
he figured out that his back hurt. He figured out that there's probably going to be a pacing thing.
Building that experience
You
back.
know, and then you can tackle that with the new knowledge you have from riding the course 2 months beforehand. It's not, you don't figure it out pre-riding the course the day before. You're like, oh man, I wish I would have known that 2 months ago.
Sure.
Right.
So
that's a really good point. When you recon, you want to find your limits, so to speak. That doesn't mean that there are two different things. There's reconning a course to try to memorize the course or try to get all the details in. And I'm especially thinking of cyclocross, mountain biking, something like that. You are not trying to find your physical limits in terms of, push as hard as you can. You're taking your time and you're basically mapping that course in your brain. So you know every single part of it, right? There's that side of things. And I guess in this case, it could apply too. What if there's a weird bike path section that's a little bit technical, something like that? Yeah. But outside of that, there's the other side of reconning where you're really looking at how would I perform on this course? And that's where, finding your limits can be helpful in that regard. So, but I would argue that you could probably find those limits. You could probably figure out that your back doesn't do well with an hour and 45 minutes on any stretch of road.
you definitely could.
Right?
Sure.
Yeah. Not just that course. So, yeah. Any plugs, I guess, or tips that you could give when we're talking about lower back pain? Because that is really common.
Yeah,
really common.
and it's, typically because of how we spend most of our days in a really hip flex position.
Like right now?
Yeah, exactly. Most of our days, most people, even if you have a standing desk, you still probably spend a lot more time sitting than you're probably aware.
Yes.
And I know I butchered this the other day when I tried to explain hip flexors, but there are parts of your hip flexors, your psoas, minor and major, that do attach or originate actually on your lumbar spine. So there is something pulling on your low back connecting to you to your femur. Yeah. And when you sit in a crunched position on a bicycle in particular, those muscles stay really short and they just get tighter and tighter and tighter, and it just pulls on that lumbar, pulls on your pelvis too. But that's where all this pain initiates, and I've dealt with it. I dealt with it specific to a saddle issue, which I seldom like to pin this on a saddle because I don't care what the saddle is. If you position your pelvis right and you have the right muscles to hold that pelvis in the right position, regardless of how hard you're working, it doesn't matter what saddle you're on. I've had to retract that statement because there are situations where it very much does matter.
Yeah, some saddles really do their best effort to position your pelvis in a specific way.
Yeah, they accommodate your pelvic positioning. So if you have no pelvic placement issues, if you have the musculature necessary to keep that pelvis neutral, reasonably neutral, and you're very good at that, get a flat saddle. If, however, you recognize I have a little bit of an anterior tilt, a little bit of a posterior tilt, you can buy saddles to suit. A little dip in the saddle, a little... Different shapes of saddle accommodate different pelvic placements.
Yeah.
I'm still of the school that, you should have the musculature to tell your pelvis what the hell to do.
Strengthen everything else and then figure out the saddle.
Yeah, which leads me to.
If I could add a plug really quick for that for physique, because I don't use physique saddles, but that's actually how they have differentiated their saddles. They say
they're what opened
pelvic
my eyes
tilt,
to it.
right?
Yeah.
So they basically, like, certain saddles are for this pelvic tilt tendency or habit, and then this saddle is for a different angle, that sort of a thing. Yep. Once again, I don't use their saddles, but when I saw that, I was like, now that makes sense. Instead of just giving them weird names and having me try to guess what it's for, that was kind of a clever thing, because that's really the point. When we're talking about that lower back position. You need to have the right positioning, but that positioning also, to hold that positioning, it takes strength, right? And it takes, the sort of ability to be able to hold that.
Yeah, which is just our way of segueing into a topic we've broached many times, and that just make yourself stronger. In a general sense, make yourself stronger. A stronger body can do more, regardless of what you pointed at. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. When we talked about time trialing earlier and we talked about holding that position, some athletes are just incredibly strong and they can hold whatever that, and they're perched on the very tip of their saddle, or they are, like they have their extensions can only be so long, but their arms are longer. So they have something where their hands aren't even on there, right? Like they're really compromising what some people would be able to hold, but because of the strength they have, they won't. And I'm going to give this a solid plug right now. We mentioned this maybe a month ago now on the podcast, I think. That we were talking about strength training recommendations for cyclists. And we were talking about a plan.
More achievements. So strength, not the training so much as the outcome of the training.
Yeah, like basically like this is the mark where we feel like you're sufficiently strong for this type of cyclist.
Yeah.
And we talked about how we would have more or less a kind of like those marks put out, which is kind of like a training plan for you to work up to, right? And to be able to do that sort of a thing. And that's actually up now if you go to blog.trainerroad.com, and you can also check out the forum and look for it too, because we have a discussion and it's heating up like crazy over there on that one.
And just understand these are recommendations. They're not set in stone. This is not our way or the highway. It's not I am right. This is quite literally based on my 6-8 years of working with endurance athletes specifically, but also very specifically strength training them.
Yes.
So trying to make endurance athletes better via strength training. This isn't about strength athletes, what strength athletes should be able to do. Rather, this is about what best benefits, what level of strength best benefits endurance performance.
Oh, yeah.
Across different disciplines and with a little bit of a gender segregation.
Yes. And that's a unique demand, or I guess a unique skill or experience group, I guess I would say, in the sense that you understand innately the demands of endurance sports and then also strength training. Like I'm thinking of like Derek Teal from Dialed Health. He's a good friend of mine. And when he puts out stuff on strength training, I'm like, I ain't going to listen up because he understands that. Or Art O'Connor from Park City, another guy. Like they have these sort of, it's kind of hard to find a strength trainer that also understands innately those demands of endurance athletes and how those two things need to work together.
And probably a strength trainer who, in my case, I've seen discouragingly at first how very weak most endurance athletes are if they haven't ever addressed strength training.
Yes.
Which is why we do level 1, 2, 3, level 1 being entry, level 3 being advanced, that continuum.
Yep.
And the level 1, the requirements may seem a little light. Go do it. Go tell me if they're light, because a lot of people look at that on paper and go, oh, I can do that. And then they get in the gym and they try to do it, and they try to do it well with proper form. And in our case, you got to repeat it 5 times. We're not talking max lifts here. We're talking endurance still.
Yep.
And they can't do it. I mean, and if it is a little light for you, then maybe you're a level 2 athlete in a level 1 sport.
Yep.
But that's not the worst thing.
Yeah.
But that is something that maybe you can say, well, I have level 2 strength. Maybe I'm packing around a little extra muscle mass if I want to be a pure climber. Might steer you back the other direction. I don't want anybody to detrain in terms of strength at any point. But if you do recognize that your extra body weight is a limitation based on the type of cycling you want to be really good at, well, yeah, I mean, I'm full into the strength training thing lately. I know I'm not going to go set any mountaintop PRs anytime soon.
Yeah.
But I've accepted that, and it works for me. But at the same time, I saw endurance athletes who were surprisingly weak, and then I also saw, based on what they did, were they crit riders, were they mountain bike riders, were they gravity riders, and man, did it hold true. They just got so much stronger based on the strength necessary to be good at their specific discipline.
So I won't get into the specific prescriptions that you have, but they're all up there, so you can go and check them out on blog.trainerroad.com. But I am going to run through a few things really quick. You have, like you said, level 3, which is the strongest athletes, level 2, and level 1. So like a level 1, for example, like a rider that focuses on climbing road races, sprint triathletes, Olympic distance triathletes, half distance triathletes,
Really any triathlete.
gravel racers, Grand Fondo riders, that sort of stuff. Level 2, cross-country mountain bikers, time trialists, rolling road racers, so like the guys that maybe aren't just looking for mountaintop finishes, right? Cross-country marathon mountain bikers, full-distance triathletes, endurance track cyclists.
That's right. We lumped full distance into level 2, which makes sense. I mean, they have to have a greater level of durability and resiliency.
Durability, exactly.
On level 3, criterium racers, it's you, Pete.
Nice.
The guys who can afford to be big and still do some work, do some damage.
Yep. Cross-country or short-track cross-country mountain bikers. A guy that comes to mind for me, look at Henrik Avancini, right? When you watch him,
sure.
he looks, I don't know, it's always tough to tell because it's always relative. When, if you're around a bunch of Chris Froomes, you probably look pretty strong, right? But he looks like a very strong athlete.
But he's a good example of how this is a continuum. So even though we may class him as a level 3 guy because he does short track, he also races cross country and he does it really well carrying that extra mass.
And
so
I believe
it serves him.
I believe he's a previous marathon world champ. I believe. I might be wrong.
Great case for that.
So he's an incredible athlete. So gravity-oriented mountain bikers, enduro racers that kind of fall within that. Cyclocross racers, track sprinters. I feel like cyclocross, in some respects, you might be able to argue
probably
less.
an edge case. You could put them between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
But I mean, cyclocross, even compared to XCO, cross country mountain bike Olympic, I just think they're getting on and off the bike, the sort of obstacles they have to deal with, the super steep run ups, just stuff that requires not only explosivity but a whole lot of strength to be able to muscle through it. I mean, you watch people like Van der Poel and Van Aert, they hang in there because they're strong.
Yes.
I bet those boys can move some weight in the gym.
Sure they can.
Yes. Yeah. That's an interesting, we won't go into that too deeply. There are plenty of different theories on what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Everyone that's like a fan of road racing is like, we should all train like cyclocross racers because it makes you faster than everyone, because we're seeing Van der Poel and Van Aert do so well.
Like they're well-rounded athletes.
Right. They're just really good. But the other, but the side of this is that they're so strong. And look at Mathieu Van der Poel's season. It's like terrifyingly packed when you think about cyclocross, road racing in the spring, mountain biking throughout the summer, and road racing throughout the summer, and going back into cyclocross. I feel like him being a strong athlete has to be a part and parcel of this program.
No way he could do what he does if he weren't all around strong.
Yes,
He's
exactly.
a perfect demonstration of that. I mean, he's an exception. I mean, exceptional, even in the realm of exceptional athletes.
Yes.
So he's maybe not the best case for this, but he is a demonstration of that. But every athlete I trained, I mean, in particular, the women in particular saw better bone health. They just, the rate of injury declined so vastly.
Yes.
I mean, people, I can think of one woman in particular, she was injured all the time. And she started doing strength training with me. And this is not to toot my own horn. She just started doing strength training and was consistent with it. Injuries went away.
Yep.
I mean, she was seldom, if ever, injured past that point.
Yeah, I'm going to really knock on wood here. But I feel like I should break more often if I was a normal cyclist and everything in the crashes that I've had.
Yeah.
And I don't. And Pete, you were mentioning the same thing.
Yeah. You're just, as a stronger person, you just have more things holding you together,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah,
your
that's
muscle absorbs energy when you crash. Like we fall mountain biking all the time.
Yes, sometimes very hard.
Pretty hard crashes.
Yeah, and you're like, if your body is resilient, and this doesn't necessarily mean you have a ton of muscle on you, right? Like that's kind of the underlying thing with this. Being a strong person doesn't mean you have a lot of muscle. It just means your body is capable of producing these feats and have the resiliency in you.
Yeah,
Which
don't equate being strong with being bulky.
Yes.
Yep.
The two don't have to go together.
Yes.
You can be very strong and still be very lean and very light. Well, very light.
Yeah.
On that note, really quick, I want to run through basically just what the exercises are. Once again, we're not going to get into the prescriptions. You can go check that out at blog.trainerroad.com. But we're talking about deadlifts, back squats, bench press, barbell rows, pull-ups or chin-ups, and military press. So
overhead press.
And once again, these are kind of benchmarks, right? Like this is kind of like, this is where you should be.
They're just all good representations of what a strong body can do. Not necessarily what a strong cyclist can do, not any particular type of cyclist, but if your body can't complete these things, then you've probably got a chink in your armor that should be addressed.
and overall health, right? Like one of the things we always settle back onto is being overall healthier of a person. Cycling, that is not necessarily the best thing you can do for yourself all the time.
It's
Right.
not well-rounded. It's very focused.
Right.
Yep.
And so you can increase your quality of life overall by being a slightly healthier, stronger person.
Agreed.
100%. So you can go and actually, in one quick testimony with that, I was talking to Keegan Swenson about why, because he's doing incredibly well this year and last year.
Real good year.
His results are have just gone way up, right? And talking to him and asking what's made the biggest difference, and he said 0 question strength training. And I mentioned Art O'Connor because that's the guy he works with, and I feel like he trains athletes in very similarly in this way with strength training. And I feel like it's, if you look at Keegan, he doesn't look gigantic, but if you look at him now, then scroll through his Instagram feed and go to 2 years ago, you'll see the fact that he looked like a typical road cyclist, and he's also grown and matured and everything else. But he's stronger now. He's not gigantic. He's not some big
By
muscle
no
guy.
means bulky.
No, but he feels like it's allowed him to increase his performance levels. It's not just made him more durable, that sort of a thing. But and it's not because when we're talking about lifting weights, I feel like a lot of cyclists feel like, if I can just push a ton of weight, that means I can produce more peak power. But that's really not what we're getting at. When you strength train, you basically broaden and shore up that foundation that you have so you can build a little higher. You can have higher performance. So
beyond the direct transfer to endurance performance, we're looking for just capable bodies, durable bodies.
Yep, and I think that it's a huge help. So check it out and let us know what you guys think. The best spot to do that, like I said, is head over to forum.trainerroad.com and look for Coach Chad's strength training recommendations for cyclists. That's if you look up strength, you'll also find it. That'll be easier to do. But go in there, and there's tons of people that are already talking about how they use that. Let us know how you guys train, how this sort of thing works for you. We're curious to see. So Tim says, hey, gents, I've been listening for about 6 months now, and I'm completely hooked. He says 5 stars because I can't give 6. Super informative and entertaining. Can't be beat. Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. And if you want to leave reviews, that does help us for sure. You can do that on iTunes. If you feel like we deserve anything less than a 5-star review, just message us and let us know what we should do to be better. Hopefully you feel like we earned that 5-star review, but we're always willing to do extra to get there. He says, my question is this. I've done the Mount Washington Auto Road Bicycle Hill Climb twice now and have come close to, and he says, and he capitalizes this, so I assume that this is actually like an understood status, top-notch status, which is a sub 1 hour, 20-minute time. And he says that he's gotten close to that both times he's done it. He's 6 foot 1 inches and 175 pounds, so I need all the help I can get to break that time. He's not a typical bantamweight climber.
That's like exactly where I was, 6'2", 175.
When you were climbing really well, right? Back, yeah. So he says, typical strategy for TT events like this is a negative split, but I've read that the effects of altitude reduce available aerobic power from 3 to 12%. He says, at the altitudes of the Mount Washington course, that'll definitely affect me. The race starts at 1,500 feet and ends at just over 6,200 feet. So my question is this. Should I stick with a negative split strategy knowing that the result may just be flat as available power is reduced? Or hit the start harder than I might otherwise because I know I won't be able to bump up the power as elevation increases? I have no chance to do any altitude training, so acclimatization isn't really an option. Thanks again. Love the podcast, from Tim. We should probably explain negative splitting first. Do you want to explain kind of like, I guess, what it is and then what it feels like? It's kind of different.
Yeah, they're totally different. So the idea being, if you've kind of break whatever your event into 4 quarters, and you start off a little easier than you anticipate. For different people are capable of doing different percentage splits, but I think starting 5% or a few percent easier than you want for a quarter of whatever your duration is, and then you creep up towards that 100%. And after the second half, you start winding it up, and with the goal being ending
after the first half.
After the first half, break that 100%, and then the goal being hold on to that 100% and pick it up at the end.
Yes.
Sounds very easy.
so very not.
In your mind, it totally sounds like, all right, so I cruise for the first half, then I really wick it up.
Yeah.
But it does not feel that way.
And unfortunately, the difference between 96 and 98% is not very much. Finding that sweet spot. There's a reason not everybody kills time trials all the time. It's because it's very hard to do it correctly.
Yes.
And you're splitting very small
margins.
Exactly. The margin for error is extremely small. We're talking like 1 or 2% of your effort.
Yeah. If you negative split any more than, I'd say 1%, but maybe 2% being a little more lenient, you did it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You save too much coming in, right? It should feel like this is terrible. And then once you get to the second half, you're like, I somehow have to make it more terrible.
Yeah, I got to dig in and get more terrible.
Yep, that's basically what it feels worse. Like. And the reason that it's usually faster is because this stops people from going out too hard, using too much of their available energy, or exceeding their limits too early. Because then if you exceed, as we know, when you go over your abilities, you end up having to dip lower to be able to recover from that sort of thing, right? So the idea is that you don't go over your abilities, and then you really just trend perfectly to them by the end. Now, it's something that has to be refined in practice, negative splitting. It's something that you can absolutely apply when you're in a breakaway, for example, like a solo breakaway, and you get out and you have a gap. At that point, you should not think, I'm just going to go as hard as I can right now and then see where the cards fall. If you do have a gap and you're solo, you want to be conscious about how you pace. You can even use this for something like we have Carson City Off-Road coming up, right? And in that sort of event, you can even do that. You can look at it like for the first half, I'm going to try to not have those peaks be quite so high, that sort of a thing. So the principle itself is somewhat flexible, but the implementation, especially in a time trial, is pretty rigid.
Yeah.
And you do have to go harder than you think in the beginning, and then you somehow have to go a little bit more. Now, for this sort of a thing, and we looked into the climb and we were really shocked about this. I've heard of this climb so many times. So we're going to look at things. I know this seems strange, but we're just going to look at things in principle without even considering this climb first. And so for an hour and 20-minute effort, pacing for such a long climb like this, I'd say that the rule of thumb should be you're floating just below the surface of threshold and you break the surface somewhat regularly, but you're really not going to be, you can't ride at threshold or over threshold, that sort of a thing, and then expect to have an ideal pacing execution for an hour and 20-minute time trial.
Yeah, unless you've specifically trained to carry threshold for long periods of time, I think you're going to be hovering more like 92, 94%.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you definitely want to start out, especially when we talk about a climb, because they always have variable pitches. This one has switchbacks that get into like 20% at times. So in those cases, you're going to be forced a little over your head.
On top of what is the average grade?
It's 12%. 12% for 7.5 miles almost.
Yeah, that's hard.
That is a really long, it's really hard. That is an extremely hard climb. So looking and what he talked about on elevation, that's a really common question. So the predicted effect for this specific climb on FTP is at 1,500 feet, if assuming that, sea level FTP, right, is what he's used to. At 1,500 feet, he should be able to hold 98% of that threshold for a similar amount of time.
98% of whatever his capacity is that day. I don't even want to put it in terms of threshold.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and we're talking about, and we're not talking about a specific duration. We're just talking about if you have this ability to put this out, this is how it drops down, right? So this doesn't mean that he should ride at 98% up the climb.
So whatever your finish time is, you're going to work at, or your finish power is.
Yes.
Even that's
it's tricky.
It still doesn't quite work,
yeah.
right?
No, it doesn't.
So basically, your sustainable power, roughly around threshold, that sort of a thing. And once again, we're talking about your capacity on that day. At 1,500 feet, it should be reduced by about 2%. Down to 98%. At 3,000 feet, it gets dropped to around 95%. At 5,000 feet, 91%. 6,200 feet, 88.5%.
So your capacity for work just diminishes and diminishes and diminishes as you climb. And fatigue.
It still feels the same. That's the interesting thing, right? Yeah. So and here's where I think a lot of people go, I need to have a pacing plan with power. And it's like, at 3,000 feet, I'm going to reduce it by 3%, right?
Just chunk.
And then you settle back in, right?
It's constantly sliding. That's going to be a tough one to manage.
But that's not how it works. We just had a hill climb TT a few weeks ago here for a big peak, and you've heard it if you've done TrainerRoad before, P-Vine. I'm sure you've seen that sort of a thing in the workout catalog, but it's not modeled after that. But it's a really consistent dirt road climb that basically goes from about 5,000 feet up to 8,200 feet. Pretty tall. And you definitely experience what we're talking about here, reduction in your ability. So when I did that one, I tried to stick to my guns and be really stable pacing because I figured it would be about an hour long, and I knew that stable was the way to go. And I started out around 310, 315 because that's what I felt like was sustainable, and I could feel threshold. And you can feel that when you're riding. You know what that feeling is like. It's when you're starting to load up, and you feel like if I go any harder, the lights are they won't go out. They'll kind of pop, right? And then, it's really hard to not drop below that. That's the thing. The body, when you're at threshold, it's not a comfortable place. It's extremely uncomfortable, but you're just trying to constantly maintain that. And I maintained that feeling all the way up the climb, and my power just reduced so that at the top it was like 280, 285.
Emphasis on feeling. Because I think past that first maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes, I wouldn't look at power as anything but information. There would be no goals at all.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah, and you kind of have to take it how it goes, because like you said, you're talking about your capacity to perform on that day, right? And that may change. So when you rigidly adhere to something like that, it can
painted myself
really
into that corner a couple times. With power targets at the start of a long time trial, not taking into account how warm I am. Well, not even that, or just how good I am on that day, which is something you can't anticipate. You don't know that until you get out there. Totally. So if you set this lofty benchmark for your first 10 or 15 minutes, and if anything, those first 10 or 15 minutes need to be reined in. But if you set this power, I should be able to hold this power based on what I've done for this long. Well, that assumes you're having that good of a day. So it's risky to just put a number out there and force yourself to live up to it.
Yeah.
And conversely, on that same point, the numbers, as long as you manage them, you manage yourself appropriately, the numbers can help you reach higher and fulfill a bit more.
Sure.
Like, for example, I knew that roughly at that elevation, because I looked this up, I figured I'll probably be somewhere around 285. And there were times where my body, once again, in my mind, was so tired of being in that threshold place. It was just so tired of it. But I was like, you know what? I don't need to drop down right now. And especially when the grade decreases a bit, all we want is to drop that power down, right?
Yeah,
And
that's the other side of it. It can serve as a really good carrot too.
you just can't let it, if it's unreachable and if it's out of reach, then it's going to ruin your time trial.
Yeah, it's just, again, your perceived exertion is going to dictate. And then the power might serve as a carrot or, something above which you don't ascend.
Yes.
But it's got to largely be based on how you're feeling.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy for us to say that he should not go for the approach that he talked about of going harder in the beginning because he anticipates going lower.
That's the absolute worst thing to do.
Bad idea. Once again, you're just going to kind of chase that feeling. But in this case, I feel like the big thing for him is gearing. This is a 12% climb. And if you don't have the right gearing, a steep climb like this, you're going to be forced over your limits, and you're going to have a time trial that's going to be a roller coaster.
Depending on how you train. If you're a guy who mashes a big gear all the time in training, then your gearing becomes a bit more flexible.
Yeah, so I got super nerdy here, and I went into this and basically figured out roughly what you would need. So first of all, I made a few assumptions. I assumed that you were, because you don't have a TrainerRoad account, so I couldn't sneak and peek at your numbers, so to speak. But I assumed that you're somewhere around 4 watts per kilogram for the times that you were able to do. That would put you at 80 kilograms, which you said you are, around 315 watts, somewhere around there. So I then went to Best Bike Split and I put in basically what would give you roughly a 120 time, because that's what he's talking about. And it said that you would average 5.67 miles an hour if you were going up that, right? Okay. So looking at that speed, I then went over to an online tool that all of you guys can use, Sheldon Brown's Gear Calculator. When you go there, I promise you're going to be like, this looks like a terrible website that I'm going to get viruses from. But no, it's actually just like basically an open source website that's been maintained for a long time.
Yeah, it's just old.
Yeah, it's just old, perfectly functional. And it gets updated with some stuff too, which is pretty cool. So what that allows you to do is you can basically look at gearing needs, and this is really helpful for track cyclists or single speed riders, fixed gear riders, that sort of thing, or riders that know they're going to be pushing the limits of their gearing on a specific climb or time trial, something like that. So in this case, I assume that you have a compact crankset. I'm just going to assume that, okay? So that means that you have a 50 for the large chainring and a 34 for the small chainring.
And if you don't, you should really consider it.
Yes. And you'll see
For
why.
a 12% climb.
So when you get out of the saddle, a slow cadence, one that I would say is slow but manageable, 60 RPM, that's slow but manageable when you're out of the saddle, right? So assuming that's going to be the case, at 60 RPM, if you have your chain up in front in that 34, and then you have a 32 tooth cog in the rear, so a wide range cassette in the rear, you would be going 5 miles an hour at 60 RPM. Remember, 5.67 is the sweet spot for an hour and 20 minutes. If you have a 28 in the back, you're at 5.7. So that is your absolute floor. And at times, I feel like you might have to go lower than that. So if you can, I would totally go for a 32 being the smallest that you would have in the rear. Because then if you go to something like a 25, which would be the next gear up in most cassettes like that, if you go to a 25, 6.4 is
That's 60 RPM.
That's at 60 RPM. So you're going to have to be putting out a lot of wattage to be able to maintain 6.4 miles an hour.
Or you're just going to be dragging at 45 or 50 RPM.
Yes, exactly right. It's going to drag it down into that unsustainable range, right?
Yeah.
Where
For most riders.
Where you really start to do some harm. So looking at this, ideally speaking, you have at least a 32 in the rear. You could even do something like wide range and go for a 34 or a 36, but that means that you just really have to be diligent anytime the grade reduces. You really have to make sure that you're staying on top of that power and not slowing down, because if you have
or on
lower
top of
gearing,
that speed.
yeah, exactly, on top of the speed, right? And if you and you'll be shocked, like whenever you come to a climb when it gets steep and then it levels out, and you're like, man, I'm having to do 350 watts to go up this steep thing. And then you'll go over the flat part and be like, oh, I'm speeding up, thank goodness. And you look down, you're doing like 105. Yeah. And you're like, oh man, I should actually be staying more constant around 300. And you can get a lot of speed. So you really want to have a 32 in the rear, and I recommend a compact. And I think that can make it so that you can break that 120 and and get underneath it.
Yeah,
So,
sounds like a good plan of attack.
what a tough climb.
Yeah,
I had no clue that it averaged 12%.
Hour 20. That's like, I mean, Rose is an hour, and that's
hour 20 for me.
It's an hour if you're, I think, as fast as he is on this climb.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, pretty impressive. Mike's question. He says, over 2 months, I dropped from 145 pounds to 135 pounds, seeking improvement in power to weight ratio. However, after comparing ramp test results, both my power and my watt kg and my weight dropped. And I've maintained roughly the same ratio that he says. I'm assuming this is because my body fat percentage is at a low enough point that I may have lost muscle mass through this weight loss, which is impacting my overall strength. What is the best approach to gaining weight in my position and muscle mass back in order to just increase my strength and FTP while also improving my power to weight ratio and minimize gains in body fat? So he's really looking to improve his power to weight ratio. He doesn't want to gain any fat. He's dropped down in weight, which, by the way, 2 months dropped 10 pounds.
As a 145-pound person,
That's a big percentage of your weight.
that's a big
That's
drop.
a good point.
Yeah, so that's quite a drop that you had. I'm almost certain in that case that you probably lost a bit of muscle.
Yeah.
And the numbers back it up,
Yeah.
right?
And that's stressful on your body. Like losing weight is
Unless
hard
you
on
were safely 10 pounds overweight or over fat, I should say, at the beginning of that, then you can count on the fact that you lost a little bit of muscle mass.
Yep, exactly right. So I guess getting into this, Chad, recommendations for just gaining the right type of weight that makes you faster. That's like ideal for all of us, right?
Yeah.
I love gaining weight. I just get faster.
Well, from an endurance perspective, we're talking slow twitch fibers, right? I mean, the fast twitch have their place and the mid twitch, the intermediates do too. But really, this is about increasing your slow twitch hypertrophy. So hypertrophy being the other side of hyperplasia, hypertrophy being bigger fibers, so bigger cross-sectional area.
Yep.
And hyperplasia being more fibers. And muscle fibers can only, the fact that this is still contested blows my mind, but it seems muscle fibers can only get so big before they split, right? Before there's mitosis, whatever, I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know. But, so at some point they have to split. They can't get any larger. So that's where hyperplasia comes into play. Whether we're talking about hypertrophy or hyperplasia, in this case, you're just looking for more muscle mass. I'm not sure it really matters. Let's not even worry about that. All you're trying to do is make bigger muscles, but you want bigger muscles via the slow twitch end of things, the endurance end of things. You don't want to go in the gym and pack on a bunch of strength that helps you move your 1 rep max. You want to be able to push the pedals hard for long periods of time.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
The aerobic end of things, not the anaerobic end of things. So then you think of in terms of force, and the more force you have to exert, the bigger the fiber. Well, you're not putting out a lot of force. You're working your endurance fibers, so this is considered low force work. So if you want to grow these fibers, it's going to have to be done in a low force manner. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is hypertrophy or muscle size, muscle growth can take place in the slow twitch fibers too. This isn't limited to your fast twitch fibers. All the fibers can grow. You stress them and continue to stress them, they get bigger, assuming the nourishment and the recovery is there. So on the bike, this usually equates to one way to build bigger slow twitch muscle fibers, bigger slow twitch fibers. And I mean, look at any Grand Tour rider. Those guys are about as endurance oriented as it gets. And even the littlest guys have a lot of muscle mass on their legs.
Yep.
You can bet that's predominantly slow twitch fibers that are big. They could have a 50-50 blend of fast twitch and slow twitch, but it's their slow twitch that are the big fibers that are making up the bulk of those legs.
Yep. Yeah.
So low force work, but low power. So you can't get into just mashing a big gear, but trying to drill big watt or push big watts, because that's going to shift you more toward the intermediate spectrum. So we're talking still about easy rides, just done with basically long rides is what we're saying here. Keep the force low, keep the power low, ride for a long time. Fatigue those fast twitch fibers. Show them you need them to be bigger and more capable.
Kind of like what I did on that endurance.
Exactly what you did on that. And you even did a little bit of low force work, but that was actually with a different aim. And then in the gym, this is high rep work. You keep the load low. Again, we're not trying to recruit the fibers that are recruited when we're putting out high force. That also means you're not looking for fast repetitions either. We're not trying to bypass fibers and get straight to the fast twitch fibers. We're trying to specifically address the slow twitch fibers. So it's going to be a lot of reps, low load, not a lot of speed. And you can even go, I mean, I have seen athletes who are looking for slow twitch hypertrophy target super slow reps, where where it's not a lot of weight, but they're moving really slowly through the range of motion. I'm talking it can take 30 seconds to do a repetition. Some push it out to a minute. I mean, that's what we're talking about. It's not a lot of force being exerted, but it's being sustained for long periods of time. And that's basically aerobic endurance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then this is more if you're concerned with building beach muscle and endurance, but you can do back off sets, where you basically hit the fast twitch fibers, and then you do a lighter set to hit the slow twitch fibers, and you get hypertrophy in both fast twitch and slow twitch. Yeah. Doesn't really apply in this case, but interesting to note. And then, of course, well-timed and adequate protein. And what I mean by that is well-timed. It can't just be all at one meal. You have to disperse it over the course of a day. And the consistent science research is showing that that's in the ballpark of 25 to 30 grams per sitting, based on your body weight. And I think the recommendation right now falls at about 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Yeah.
So however you divvy that up, your body can only absorb so much protein at a time. It's going to pack the rest away in fat tissue, which is what you're looking to avoid. So, maybe for you at your weight, that's probably closer to 20 grams a serving. And you do that 4 or 5 times a day. And we've talked that it's not necessary to time it specifically pre-workout or post-workout so much that you get it, and you get it consistently. So pick 4 or 5 times a day to get 20 grams of protein, and probably don't exceed that. I don't think a body your size needs much more than that per serving.
That's also assuming that you're doing this sort of work, whether it's the long, slow stuff, because there are a lot of people that aren't going to be doing this sort of work, and I don't want you to hear that you have to just eat protein bars all day now.
No, but if you're doing the work. If you're looking to add muscle, I mean, the fortification for that muscle has to be there. You got to provide it with the building materials. So if you're going to do the work, then you got to fuel that work. And in this case, that fuel is very much about protein.
100%. Can we get into Daniel's question? This one's super interesting. Yeah. He says, I just did a ramp test and didn't get the result I had hoped for. When reviewing my data...
happens all the time.
Every time.
I hope for 400 every time. Perennially disappointed. He says, when reviewing my data, I noticed that my heart rate didn't reach its peak of 210 during the test, instead achieving a max of 184. During VO2 intervals, I'm able to achieve 210 in most cases. Should I be reaching for max heart rate during a ramp test? Was I over fatigued and therefore not able to get there? Love the podcast, 5 stars. So this caused us all to kind of sit back and think, because we don't really take into account heart rate. We really just care about power when we're talking about the ramp test, right? And we really care about your ability to perform. That's what we care about, right? With that sort of a thing. So this kind of made us all kind of sit back and look at this. And actually, you looked into some data on this too.
Yeah, I did. I dug fairly deep, or I looked at lots of different riders, kind of riders I was familiar with. I kind of knew, I trusted their tests. I trusted they were trying hard, and they had heart rate data. So one of the kind of interesting things, or, just like the ramp test is always, just like every assessment or every performance, it varies on the day, right? It's even more noticeable when you're looking at dozens of ramp tests of people a lot of it just comes down to like showing up and performing on your ramp test day. And so for a lot of people, that meant it's kind of apparent. People either train directly into the ramp test and they treat it just like another piece of the puzzle and they're moving forward. And that actually gets more consistent results, it looks like to me. I mean, like I said, this is small sample size, but just the people who regularly do it and just treat it as part of their kind of workflow, they seem to get more consistent results, and their heart rate data that goes along with it doesn't vary quite as much. The people who are kind of I call them like they're really leading into their ramp test. They put some stock into how they're paved their way. They're paving their way.
Tapering for a ramp test.
And it's like, look, they did a coffee shop ride on Sunday, like a warm up, like topper on Monday, and then all out on the ramp test. And so, just with a freshness, your heart rate, you'll be able to achieve a different max heart rate with different amounts of freshness in your body. So one of the things that I did is I've taken the ramp test a lot in my life, and I have 18 of them apparently, and so 10 of them I had heart rate data, and my range of heart rate is. So let's start with my max heart rate's 180. If I hit 180 beats, I would almost be laying on the ground.
Verging on death.
But now we know I would turn it off and I would stop pedaling before that. So 180 is definitely my absolute max. I've never hit 180 in a ramp test. which is interesting. I've done 178, 179 a couple times, but never actual max heart rate. A lot of my best power numbers are more like 174, 175, kind of in that low 170s. And they're always after consistent training, which is interesting. It just doesn't make any sense that I'd get inflated numbers from resting. But my body likes to have kind of residual fatigue, and that's when I put out the best numbers.
Yeah. So I guess with heart rate, it varies, and it really isn't the objective.
No.
It doesn't matter what your heart rate is, as long as you can perform.
A pretty wide range of heart rate and still the same level of performance, still the same power output.
I've even had high heart rate with low power data.
Oh, totally.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, just the you get on the bike and you can tell that something isn't quite firing that day. And not that means you should throw away your ramp test, but you should always be paying attention to how you're feeling when you get on your bike, whether it's a workout, whether it's a test, whether it's anything. And like you were talking about your notes, like just pay attention and put your notes in your workout. Say heart rate, or I felt a little strange today, or I felt a little fatigued. Heart rate was high, or Nate does a really good job of this. Whenever I look at Nate's workouts, he always puts sleep, eat, heart rate was high, and just having that kind of check in with yourself. It gives you a better scope of what you're trying to do, which is very handy in the long run.
I honestly don't think people are going to achieve a maximum heart rate in a ramp test anyway, unless, and this is not part of the test, and I'm in no way recommending this, that as you're on the verge of failure, you're just about to pull the plug, or more like quitting, whatever, just about to bail, get out of the saddle and sprint as hard as you can for 10, 12, 15 seconds, however long it lasts.
Because that's like a tendency for some people.
Yeah, but if you do that, so if you've pushed yourself to just near breaking, then you get out and you sprint and give every last little bit of, probably the fibers we're not even really looking at recruiting, but a little bit of additional oxygen uptake, a little bit of higher heart rate. Then wait, 5, 10, 15 seconds after that, because it'll probably ramp a little farther. Then you might actually see a max heart rate.
You're probably not going to see any sort of performance improvement.
Well, no, and I'm not advocating this in any way. I think that's the only way at the end of a ramp test you're going to see max heart rate. I just don't think the ramp test elicits maximum heart rate.
Yeah, in some cases you might hit those values sooner than you would, because days vary and your heart rate varies, and that's just the thing. So if you do hit it, and if you do hit it every time, cool, but it really doesn't matter. Really,
it doesn't matter.
We're just talking about performance.
No.
I looked back at my ramp tests, and my max heart rate is about 187, and at least that's the highest that I've seen recently and within the past year, and I've never hit it. So I've always been in the 170. I even did one where I topped out at 171, and I still had really good performance in terms of power. So like, it just shows the fact that if you are paying attention to that, especially during it, I would stop. I would just be paying attention to hitting your marks with that power, making sure that you get everything out of yourself.
Yeah, the only way I would allow heart rate to give me pause during a ramp test is if I knew going into it I was feeling poorly, as I moved through the test, I didn't start feeling any better. I noticed I couldn't elevate heart rate, and my power's sucking, and I feel terrible. So if it's part of the puzzle, maybe I'd give it a little bit of credence, but it's absolutely not the one thing to base this by, for sure. And it's not even a vital component to a ramp test. I don't think it's really hard for me to see where it will make a big difference if you don't have heart rate data on a ramp test.
Absolutely. Let's go through 2 more questions. Let's rip through these ones and get to some of the questions that you submitted live to YouTube and Facebook. This one's from Jason. He says, first off, 5 stars all around. I started listening to the podcast, and all of your insight convinced me to get a subscription. Thanks, man. Thanks for trusting us with your training. That's huge. He says, I love TrainerRoad, and I try to evangelize as much as I can. And that is very much appreciated as well.
Yes, it is.
Tell your friends, even though that will make them faster too. He says, now to the question. I live in Minnesota, and my focus really is cyclocross. But I race crits in the summer and dabble in triathlon, then also mountain bike race year round. So you do a lot. Says, I did my first TrainerRoad block this winter, and I had substantial gains. It was fantastic. However, as has been a topic lately, life happened and my spring went very badly. I still have a lot of base fitness from an Ironman last year and all the training I've done, but my crit performance has really suffered, once again, because life happened. In other words, it sounds like he wasn't able to train as he wanted to train, right? So looking ahead to this fall, I'm going to do a low volume, short power build plan. That's one of the plans that we have. He says supplementing with the remainder of the road season, meaning that he'll mix in some road races there. And then cyclocross specialty phase, setting up for my A race of the Trek World Cup in late September. The challenge that I'm facing is my pain cave. I do not have central air conditioning. My training environment will get into the 80s and 90s with humidity in the summer. I have fans and can move the air, but are there any tips and tricks to getting a warm, humid room cool? Or should I use it as heat conditioning and grid it out? I would really appreciate some insight or tips and tricks. Then he says, you all should come out to the Midwest for the Fat Bike Berkey next March. It was a balmy 30 degrees Fahrenheit this year. Consider the gauntlet thrown down. Go ahead and pick that gauntlet back up. We're not gonna pick it up for you. Sounds terrible. So first things first, just going into things that he could do to cool off the room. I feel like we should go into that and dry it out. There are dehumidifiers. I'm sure you're well aware of that. There are fans. You say you have fans. You can get bigger fans that are more like industrial strength, and they can move air. And when that happens, it can dry out as long as it has an escape route to get out of there. That said, if you're just pulling humid air in, it doesn't really do a whole lot. The other thing that you can do is if this is a garage, you can throw in insulation on the back of your garage door. You can get like kits at like any like Home Depot, something like that. And then that can help it maintain a better temperature. But those are all like big things that I would say. And to be honest, there's really not a whole lot you can do if the outside environment is hot and humid, which in Minnesota it is in the summer. Yeah. And then you have inside environments that don't have air conditioning, because air conditioning dehumidifies too. But if you don't have that, then you kind of have what you have.
Yeah. So basically, you're just going to have to get good at training in heat and humidity.
Which we've talked about that before.
We have, and we've also talked about how it limits high performance and that you can't really do the super hard stuff without overwhelming yourself, overheating to the point where your body regulates and won't allow you to work that hard. So you can't achieve the training stress that we're looking for. Can and cannot. I mean, there are kind of ways around that. So I don't think there's anything wrong with using this as a form of acclimatization. I mean, you're actually in the environment, experiencing it. Why not adapt to it with your sub-threshold work, and all the way up through sweet spot? I think threshold's going to be, it's going to start to become a really tall ask over the course of the workout, because your body temp, your core temp is just going to rise, and that's going to become limiting at some point. But maybe as high as 90%, 92%, maybe that type of workout, sweet spot workouts, you might be able to do them in this heat, and that will serve you really well in terms of both your physiologic adaptations that will carry over to race day, and then of course your habituation or your mental familiarity with this sort of stress. But as far as the high intensity stuff, if this is simply your lot in life, you're stuck here, you can't do anything about it, and you can't make the room any cooler. I mean, we have some recommendations, but say they don't pan out, or say you're already doing that and you're still suffering these challenges, then tweak those high intensity workouts. And this might seem like it's going backwards a bit, because I used like 30 VO2 max work to work up to 3-minute VO2 max intervals. But in your case, those 3-minute intervals generate so much internal temperature, and they get you there pretty fast, that on the one hand, you could spend a lot of time recovering between them so that your core temperature comes back down so that you can do it again and reach, get through the 3 minutes before your core temp is elevated too high. Or you can go back to like the 30-30s that we're talking about, that we typically start you with, not end you with. But in that case, it allows you to get a lot of time at a particular output, a particular power output, without revving up your breathing rate. Your core temperature is really what we're concerned with here. I just did them the other day, and I could just continue to bang them out. And I made intermittent use of the fan because I just wasn't overheating like I would if I were doing longer intervals.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's a really good tip.
So you can still get quite a lot of training stress, on target training stress, without suffering the consequences of training in a hot room, and a humid one at that.
Yep. Now, and it's worth saying that at the end of September for the Trek Cup there, it could be anything up in Minnesota. It could be freezing and snowing. It could be really hot and humid. Who knows what it could be, being shoulder season like that. But I think that kind of what you're getting at here in this case is the fact that you understand, Jason, that when you're training and in hot conditions, that you may not be able to reach your peak performance potential, right?
Yeah, you probably can't.
Training in that. And I believe the question is basically like, is that holding me back from increasing that performance potential? And yeah, I mean, I'm sure it is. But the thing is, if it is what it is and you can't change it, then that's what you have.
Yeah, but I still think he can eke a lot out of a particular type of training. I mean, this is a mountain bike race, so
or cyclocross,
and cyclocross, which are really intermittent event or amounts of work separated by sub-threshold, but real close to threshold. So basically what I just described, working at about 90% and then punching way above it for short periods of time.
Yep. And the other side of things is if it is hot and humid, you may have a leg up on everybody that was training in an air conditioned experience the whole time. So
absolutely
it can totally help. One other thing in terms of like cooling and drying the room, if you have an evaporative cooler, which you probably don't, being in a humid environment, because they just don't work in those humid environments.
Not so much.
They're great here in the dry environments because they make your house a lot more comfortable, everything else.
Yeah, they're useless in humidity though.
But exactly right. You're not going to be changing much at all in that case. So the other thing, I guess, you could look at a cooling vest. We're talking about tips to, I guess, you kind of look at cooling your environment, and when you can't do that anymore, then you look at cooling yourself, right?
And I have limited experience with this. I used a cooling vest for a while in my basement during the peak summer season. And I don't know, I had some good workouts. I didn't do it long enough to definitively say, oh no, cooling vests work. But it makes sense they work. I mean, anything that's going to bring your core temperature down and allow you to work a little harder before it elevates to the point where it restricts you, makes sense to me.
The only complexity you might run in there is if you have a cooling vest that doesn't have any sort of mesh paneling.
Yeah, the breathing could be a...
Yeah, because if you don't have any air, going over that portion of your body because it's blocked by something that isn't porous at all, then you're also going to build up more heat as well. So even though you may be cooling it, it's kind of tricky to tell. But they do make some cooling vests that are actually mesh.
Yeah. Okay.
If you Google it, you can check them out. There are a lot of different options that you could use there.
So they're still hanging in there.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen them on Pro Tour riders when they're warming up. So there's got to be some efficacy.
Oh, yeah. There's got to be, right? Yeah. I guess you could also on the food side of things too, right? Like use food to cool yourself down.
Yeah, and I'm a fan of like the slushy at hot races. I put it in the cooler.
Been demonstrated to work well. And
even if your core temp stays cooler for that first 10 minutes, I mean, that gives you 10 minutes more of working out. So, and it's pretty easy to drink. It's just put it in the blender, put some ice cubes, put your electrolyte mix, blend it up, put it in a bottle, and you're set.
I've been thinking about like Tulsa Tough. You've done that race plenty of times, and that one's hot and humid.
Hot.
And hard because the speed isn't very high at all on Crybaby Hill. Yeah. So then you really feel like you're, cooking.
It's just hot.
Yeah, you do. You just cook until you're up over the top of that thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess you could even have like frozen. You could like freeze things like little snacks, so to speak, too.
Yeah, I talked, I think last week about frozen grapes. I mean, they're pretty great because they go down super easy. It's almost like a lozenge that you accidentally swallow. It's like, oh, that's gone. But then you have this little, pocket of cooling in your intestinal tract.
Yeah, it can totally help.
Your stomach anyway.
You could even, one thing that we accidentally did is we froze my son's fruit snacks once. So, and if you have something like that where you, let's say you take in blocks or you take in anything like that, you could freeze those things beforehand and that could help, right? Freeze your gummy bears if you're one of those gummy bear people. But and the other side to think of too, like let's say this race ends up being a freezing cold, snowy mess. It's not all for naught training in the heat like that, because it's been proven through studies that training in the heat also helps cold performance. It's not like it just helps you training in the heat, right? So it has, I think it's additional aerobic adaptation.
It just helps performance. So if you go in there, if you're back out, the adaptations are physiologic ones because they're going to carry to any environment.
Yeah, exactly right. Last one, ready for it?
Let's do it.
Yes.
Okay, and then we'll go to the live ones. Dylan says, hey guys, have you heard of the Whoop strap that tracks recovery, sleep, strain throughout the days? Pete?
Yeah.
Raise the hand.
I got one.
Pete's
been on there for quite some time.
Yep. I've used one for quite a long time as well. I don't have mine on right now. It's somewhere in San Diego. Mountain biking has a way of snagging things and making them fall off, I guess. He says, sounds like an interesting product. Is it a gimmick or is it really something that I can benefit from to prevent overtraining? So I wanted to put this one in and talk about more than just Whoop, but really just talk about measuring recovery. It's the holy grail. It's what we all wish we could do, that we could measure recovery as we can measure performance. That would be amazing.
It's the seeming low-hanging fruit, but we just can't seem to grab it somehow.
It's really complex when you get down to it, right? Yeah. Because you're measuring things, all the different inputs that we have, you have to have some sort of extrapolation within that. And there's a lot of variance, plenty of stuff. So I guess first things first, Whoop, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
And then we can get into, Chad, you've used RestWise, and you've just started using something else too.
Yeah, an Ember.
Ember.
From
so
Circa Core.
we can talk about our experiences with that. So like with Whoop, when I've used that, Basically, and then you can get into more detail, but I'll just kind of lay out what it gives you. But basically, it's just a small heart rate strap that you wear. That heart rate strap is able to measure HRV, able to measure your heart rate, and then and also with accelerometers, it's able to measure like movement data. It's very good at picking up sleep, I've found. It's a great sleep tracker.
Yeah.
And what it does is it quantifies the quality of your sleep as well as quantity and quality. It gives you both of those details, and it graphs your body's behavior throughout that sleep, so then you can get some insight into that. And then it also gives you from that, unlike something like a Fitbit that's just counting steps, that sort of stuff. Really what they do is they use that information, plus when you wear it in your training, they use that information too, and they give you recovery and strain, those two metrics. And those are the kind of things that you're looking at. And it basically gives you a recovery score, and it measures the strain that you have.
Yep.
And it basically tells you when you're ready to perform and when you're not ready to perform based off of that.
Yep.
So how have you found it to be useful in your experience?
It's interesting. I paid for one last year at about August or September. So I've been using it a fair amount. It was really interesting. I wasn't in very good shape. I just had come back from my honeymoon when I started using it. And it took a little while to learn me, but then I was constantly changing. So there was some, it took a little while for me to kind of reach a training equilibrium where the data that I was outputting was usable, which is interesting. So
and I feel like that's across the board.
It's across the board.
Everybody that uses it, if your lifestyle is just going crazy and every day it's entirely different and you're sleeping at different times and then you're not training, then you're training really hard, it's going to not know what to do with you.
Yeah, then it's difficult, right? But over the winter, it worked really, really well. I would say the sleep tracking is very, very good.
That's the best part for me too.
Easily the best I've ever used. It does a really good job with some questions when you go to sleep and when you wake up in the morning, and it can kind of educate you on things you do that are impacting your sleep.
Interesting.
And it does a good job of, I feel like it kept me accountable.
Exactly.
And it made me, my sleep quality and what I was doing for that, it made me keep that present. Even if it didn't necessarily coach me through to better sleeping or something like that, it made me think of it. And when I thought of it, I ended up doing it. What they say, what's measured, is something, I'm going to screw it up, but what's measured improves, something like that.
What gets measured gets managed.
Yeah,
there we go.
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
So I would say for me, I changed my habits, or this is what it changed for me. I now go to sleep pretty much at 9 p.m. every night because that's when my body is the happiest and loves to go to sleep then. I wake up, I feel really good at 5:30 or 5:45 or 6 o'clock in the morning. I am not sleepy when I get up. I read before bed. No screens. I mean, that's pretty obvious.
It asks you if you do that every day, every time.
Every single night.
It says, did you do this before you went to sleep? Did you, and it even says did you sleep with somebody else in the bed or something else like that? Yeah.
So, if I read and go to sleep at 9 o'clock, I'm pretty much guaranteed to have a wonderful night's sleep, that's probably the single biggest change I've made in my life, and it made a big difference. I always feel pretty good day in and day out. The strain for mountain biking and cross training, especially, it works really, really well. There's some, I think, since we're so in tune with power meters and we know our bodies really well, that sometimes it feels like it doesn't necessarily apples to apples with like what I'm seeing from my power meter, but it's grown to become better at that.
Because it learns you.
Yeah, it learns me. And so definitely in the last few months, it's much more, one-to-one like strain on my TSS versus my strain gauge. I would always say they're pretty similar now. But like we were saying, it's kind of like stepping on the scale every day. It's part of my daily process now, so it doesn't feel like work. And I just log it, and it's stuff that I can pay attention to, keeps me honest. My HRV data has really kind of the window that I used to see is closed because my life is a little more, I guess I'm just doing the same things all the time.
Stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the rolling average is predictable and based on that. So I would actually say it worked really well for me. And I still find use out of it. I know some people have said they would probably figure out what's going on and then change and then get rid of the strap or get rid of whatever device they're using. I like changing things up. Like, I can't wait to lift a bunch of weights in the fall. It's fun, right? Like, I like to see what different things do to my body, and the Whoop does a really good job at showing me what I'm doing.
Yeah. I'd say that for me, where I didn't, and it kind of wants you to use it this way, where basically it says like, all right, your recovery score is this, you're primed to take on a ton of work. And it's almost always correct, but in some cases it really wasn't correct. And that happens because once again, it's measuring off of heart rate, and it might shift on your wrist or something like that. And there were a few times I remember, like before Sea Otter, it was like you had terrible recovery, right? And I had an incredible day. I rode really well. So I shouldn't say I had an incredible day. It was just a good day. Like, I fulfilled my potential, I would say. So that can be kind of tricky with that. But yeah, I've found it. I echo what you say. It is helpful. The hard thing is when you really get into using it to really tailor and adjust your training, that's where things get really tricky. But when we're talking about just keeping yourself accountable for sleep and recovery, it's really good at that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Chad, what about the tools you've used? RestWise is a service online. It doesn't have any sort of strap or anything like that.
It's just a questionnaire, really.
Cool.
Well, questionnaire, and it does a couple of measurements. The measurements, I think, are optional, though. But it gives you a recovery score, too. And then what you do with that recovery score is, I think, kind of up to you. I mean, it would give you a recommendation based on that recovery score, but it's for you to decide, well, when my recovery score is between here and here, I still have a good workout, so I'm still going to I'm going to modify those recommendations based on my personal self-knowledge. But it would ask for heart rate, and if you had a finger sensor for muscle oxygenation or blood oxygenation, you could input your SpO2 also. Then body weight, hours of sleep, quality of sleep, energy level. Basically, it just walked you through a bunch of questions. You know, how was yesterday's performance? What's your appetite like? Do you have symptoms of illness, muscle soreness? What's your urine color? And then there's a comments box, and it would just give you a percentage recovery score and inform you on how they think you should interpret it. So, and I used it for long enough that I started tying recovery scores to workouts and performance, and it seemed worthwhile. I wasn't overly impressed, if I'm honest. I think it was good in the sense that it made me do it every day, and it made me, like you guys say, aware of what time, how much sleep I'm getting, and how that impacts my day, when I'm going to bed. It didn't force me to do a lot of those things, but I did them because I wanted record of them. But I got away from it. Like I said, I wasn't overly impressed. I do think there's merit there, though.
Yeah, for sure.
But so now I'm using and I just recently purchased it, and I've only been using it for 3 or 4 weeks now, and I've kind of fallen off. So I've got a patchet or a chasm in the data there. So I'm probably gonna have to start fresh. But it's called the Ember. The company who makes it is called Circa Core, and it measures a ton of things. How useful all those things are going to be remains to be seen. But
you can measure all the things. It doesn't necessarily mean.
And they're all useful in their way, and they explain why they're useful. But this one, it's a fingertip sensor, and it goes to its own little device, and then that device transmits to your phone and their app. So it's its own hardware device, and then they have the app on your phone, which logs everything and tracks it and gives you your charts and your trends and all that. But it measures hemoglobin, and this is all done through the fingernail on your small finger, heart rate variability, oxygen saturation, and respiration rate. And then it gets really techie with the amount of CO2, or a CO2 measure, which is the amount of hemoglobin that's actually saturated with oxygen. So somehow they put that together. Something called methemoglobin, which is the percentage of hemoglobin in an oxidized state. So basically, this is the hemoglobin that's unable to bind with oxygen. A perfusion index, which is the strength of your blood flow. Oxygen content, which is not the same as SpO2, which is oxygen saturation. The content is the amount of O2 bound to hemoglobin, whereas the SpO2 is the amount of hemoglobin saturated with O2.
Wow.
Don't ask me to explain the difference between
a lot of stuff.
And then finally the pleth variability index, which is a variation of the perfusion index over your breathing cycle. So as you breathe in and out, what happens to your muscle perfusion. And it's not cheap. The device itself is $400. You can go $699 or $700, and you get all of those. Otherwise, you're restricted, and you can add on little packages. Not real happy with all that, and I'm hoping I'm getting this wrong. But for some of the measures that I really want, it's dinging me for credits. It started me with 200 credits, and now it's taken those credits away. But I bought the pricey one, which promises all of those. So I'm hoping that when my credits deplete, they automatically replete.
Rather than
because if they don't, then I just got took, and I'm not going to be real happy about that. But I don't think that's the case. So we'll see.
Yeah.
It's too soon to say.
Yeah. So in an ideal world, all of these things would be like, you need to adjust your workout by list. That would be amazing. And we're getting closer to that. I think that, and especially I would say just in my personal experience, Whoop has done a really good job of pushing that side of things.
They
getting closer.
They just came out with a new strap.
Yeah.
That's the one I'm wearing. And it'll tell you while you're working out live feedback on the range of strain that you should achieve.
Yeah.
So instead of just going for a ride, you can look and say, oh, I'm at the minimum of the recommended.
And that's what all of these do.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And as long as the data is good, those recommendations are going to be fine. But that's the hard thing, is that the data isn't perfectly it doesn't perfectly represent your abilities of that day. We're getting closer.
And I did neglect to mention that the member does take other, like, what's your mental state? What's your sleep quality? It tracks some other more subjective stuff. So I think it's going to paint a really complete picture. Whether or not all those things are necessary, I don't know. Maybe they'll prove to be really useful.
Yeah.
It's far too soon to say.
Yeah.
I'm encouraged. I wouldn't have bought it in the first place.
Yeah. The other side of things that's cool with the new Whoop one too is the fact that it now broadcasts via Bluetooth your heart rate data.
Works with TrainerRoad.
So then you don't need a heart rate strap, which is nice.
Really nice.
The previous gen one didn't do that, and that was always annoying. I kid you not, I had a heart rate monitor on one wrist that I couldn't do anything with. Then my watch that was a heart rate monitor on the other one, and because it only broadcasts via Amp Plus, I couldn't get that to my phone. So it's like super annoying to have all that stuff going on.
And then you were also wearing heart rate strap.
Yes, exactly right. It was ridiculous. Yeah. So, but anyways, having that is really nice because that will throw the data up. A lot of people say optical heart rate stinks and it's not very good. That depends on a number of different factors. Yes, on how you wear the device, but also on your skin pigment, I've heard. On
placement on your arm.
Yeah, on my terribly pasty bad skin, it is awesome.
It works super well.
I've heard that.
Are people wearing the Whoops up top too?
Some are, and I noticed zero difference, zero improvement, I should say, in the data that I had when I wore a high versus low. Yeah. It didn't have any difference. The problem in my case, isn't that it's shifting around or anything like that. It's just mountain biking is really rough. They've changed the strap, and I think it's going to work better. But it's worth saying that if people, I've heard, and DC Rainmaker knows a lot about this, and you guys should check it out. But if you have really hairy arms and the optical heart rate sensor is on that, it's probably not going to get a great fix. Also, it seems like there's a correlation if you have more, I guess it's not pigment, but I guess if you have tanner skin, on that spectrum, if you're pasty like me, things seem to work out really well with optical heart rate. On the other side of things, not quite as well. So Chad and I are doing great.
Chad, you're set.
No problems there.
It's the only time it's good to be pasty, right? So that's kind of our feedback on those ones, and it's a super exciting spot and one that I'm really excited to see more companies do more in. So. I'm going to head over to YouTube and check out some of the live questions that have been submitted so then we can see if you have any good ones. I know there's one right from the beginning that I want to talk to with you, Pete. Scrolling back up. Okay. It looks like it removed the top one. Let's see.
Do you remember it?
Yeah, they removed the top one. Okay, so somebody says, what type of strength training and how often is needed to boost bone growth and testosterone levels significantly? And would the training impede cycling performance? So I don't know if we know the answers directly, like this much improves this much. On the other side of things, it has shown to improve those things and to help them.
They're definitely correlated.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody will argue that. And then as far as the overlapping benefits or the interruptions, or it's just the not playing nice, which does happen. I mean, endurance and strength are basically two ends of a spectrum. So if you want to be especially good at one, then trying to be especially good at the other is going to come at the expense of it. There's a balance to walk there. And that's basically what these requirements are. This balance is skewed heavily toward endurance performance, but it does weave in the strength side of things. But we've talked in depth in the past about how different cell signaling takes place based on what activity you do. I mean, you're sending your body distinct messages, and then you send it distinct messages that are asking it to do almost the polar opposite. There's going to be some overlap and some some aspects of it that aren't going to benefit both sides of that performance spectrum.
Yep. We have another good one for you, Pete.
Okay.
How do you move from the back of the pack toward the front over the course of a technical, very punchy P1-2 crit? So this obviously depends on the course.
Yeah.
Depends on the racers. But are there any like general tips or principles that you could give on moving from front to back on a punchy technical crit with a fast group?
There's the easiest way to think about it is there's a small sphere surrounding you all the time, and that you can kind of move around in your sphere. So you only have a couple feet in each direction, but if you can kind of amplify that small amount of space you're taking up, and so you're moving further distances in like a corner. So if everybody's taking the corner and they're all following their route, if you can kind of gain 1 or 2 or 3 feet in the same corner that everybody else is also taking, you're moving forward without doing the work, right? And so there's a bunch of times it's kind of this constant thing where you should be trying to figure out a way to get a little bit more just close more distance between you and the front of the race.
So you're basically chipping at it.
You're basically chipping at it. And what you have to do is not care about anybody else. And I'm not saying you're going to ride over people, but you can't let other people impact the way you're chipping away at the course and at the race. So when the race slows down, you need to make bigger chips to get further up in a shorter period of time. When the race is really fast, really you just don't want to give up anything, right?
Yeah.
And one of my like real memories of the first really fast races, it was fast for like 45 minutes. You know, it wasn't fast for a lap or two. It was 45 minutes of hanging on for dear life. Yeah. And then as soon as it slows down, you have to do one more effort and you pass 20 or 30 people. But it's staying on it enough that you have to capitalize on when it slows down, and when it is fast, you still are chipping away. You still, if you can pass someone without any real work, it's the small little victories that you can get over and over the course of a couple laps. You know, that might be 10, 20 guys, but if you're 30 from the front and then your 10th wheel, all of a sudden your path is a little cleaner. So it's find those tiny little pieces of moving up you can grab all the time. And it could be in straights, it could be in turns, it could be up the hill or down the hill. Just always be grabbing forward.
Always be searching for that sort of stuff. Can I give another tip?
Yeah, let's do it.
Follow people like Pete. Seriously. It's find the guys. You'll notice that inexperienced guys are going to be going really fast maybe, and they'll be working their way through a pack. You probably don't want to grab onto that wheel because they may be doing so inefficiently. And even though you're in their draft, you may be working inefficiently. I always find it really helpful if I'm in a situation like that to find a really experienced rider that has much more experience than me. And if I hold on to them, I'm going to be able to really move through better.
There's a lot of confidence that comes with following a strong wheel too. When you know somebody's a very good criterium racer or very good on that particular type of course, and you get that wheel, it's pretty inspiring.
And the same thing, if you find yourself behind someone who is not doing things correctly, it even messes me up. You know?
Sure.
It feels terrible. So get away from that person as fast as you can, even if you're giving up wheels. Get away from the person who are braking really hard into the corner and sprinting. If there's someone sprinting out of every straightaway, get far away from that person.
Yeah, it's only going to hurt you.
It's only going to hurt you.
Yep. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Another question. Somebody says, where can I get Chad's Get Faster mug? Those are very, very, very exclusive. We have mugs, and then we have those mugs. So sponsored athletes have them. Not even all of our sponsored athletes, but some, like the pro teams, like Stan's Pivot Pro Team, a few others. Coach Chad has one, obviously.
I have two.
And we have them here at the office for our employees to use, but they're fancy Yeti mugs. They're real nice.
Quite nice.
So another one on race tactics.
Yeah.
This one says, is there a way to get past a mental block I have against endurance-paced workouts? I nail workouts with VO2 intervals or over-unders, things of that nature, but holding a steady endurance-paced effort gives me an RPE of 12 out of 10. Is this a mental hurdle, or am I simply geared better for intervals? For background, all my race wins have come from crits and have only had a few podiums on the road. Thanks. Is this you, Pete?
Yeah, I was going to say, I wrote in, this is me.
You can still derive a lot of benefit from those long, steady rides, though, so do them. Make yourself do them, especially if you hate them. Yes. I bet you can level up. And I've tried a number of things because I'm kind of in the same boat. I mean, anything over an hour at a slow effort level is just brutal. And that hour goes by pretty slowly.
Yeah.
So I watched, I don't know if you've seen the movie Us. Certain movies are so immersive. And scary movies seem to work real well in this respect. Subtitles do too, but they hold my attention well enough that I'm not watching the clock. I've tried reading. I watch khanacademy.org, little webinars on Khan Academy. I can kill a day on that website. But if you do that while you're writing, and basically your mind wants to wander, but you give it something to focus on, time slides by a little more easily.
Yeah, and if I could give you an opposite thing too to do with that, and this is going to be much more painful. You're going to front load your pain. When you do those sort of things, when I was doing traditional base this fall, and even last year doing more steady state work that was of higher intensity, I tried to remove distraction. I eased my way into that. I didn't just drop it one day and expect the performance to be the same, but I tried to remove distraction. I still keep music going, but I got it to the point where I wanted to be very okay with dwelling in that uncomfortable space.
Oh, that sounds awful.
And and I wanted to be okay with that. It was a total weakness of mine. I mean, 3 years ago, if you had asked me to do a 10-minute sweet spot interval, I was like, please no. Like, that's the worst thing in the world that could happen. But now I can do an hour long at threshold, and I can hold
that seems like needless suffering to me. I have this vision of riders back in the day on their rollers in the laundry room staring at a wall.
Concrete wall.
Which is why trainers get such a bad rap, because that's
a bad way to experience
time.
That said, I feel like you do build a bit of mental fortitude, and you say you've gone through something like that. So there's a balance to be struck. And at first, I would absolutely encourage you to, like Chad said, to work in a lot of the stuff that can occupy your mind. That can be really helpful. And with time also, even if you don't remove the distractions, look back at that workout after you've done that and you've been like, I just did 8 minutes at steady state. I just did 10 minutes. I just did 15. I just did 20.
But there's a multitasking aspect to it too. I mean, I could say like, I want to watch that movie. Like I wanted to watch this movie, but I didn't want to sit on the couch for an hour and a half and watch a movie. So I was like, I'm going to do my workout. And I did a pretty tough VO2 max, like clouds rest +2 or something.
That's hard.
And it just flew right by. So even with the harder workouts, the intermittent ones, mind you, but even with the harder workouts, it worked out. But I've talked in the past about how I used to reserve, I think Luke Cage. I couldn't watch Luke Cage unless I was doing my endurance work. So that was my incentive to get on the bike, disconnect and watch it, but doing something else. And I have a hard time getting behind sitting and watching a movie because it doesn't seem productive. But if I'm also knocking out a bike workout in the process,
it's not so bad.
Yeah.
I have one more takeaway. As the way I do it is I kind of make those workouts slightly easier. So if I have 5-10 minute blocks of sweet spot, you'll see I almost always opt for those stepped ones where you do an 80 or an 85, a 90, a 90. And I know by the time I get to the end, and just I lead in, I feel terrible at the beginning of sustained workouts.
Oh, yeah.
And so I always start easy, like 80%.
Absolutely.
It's doable.
Yeah.
And then I also will turn down, like Nate makes fun of me because I can't do a threshold workout to save my life, and I can't, but I can do sweet spot workouts if it's supposed to be a threshold workout. And it's still, I mean, I'm probably robbing myself of something, but at least I'm doing something, right?
Yep, exactly.
And I love those stepped ones because when you're at 95%, you go, oh, I only have one 10-minute block after this, and it's going to be 100%. It's going to be awesome. Yeah. And then every once in a while, I'll feel so good, rewind the workout, do the last one again.
A lot of my workouts are designed specifically to incentivize or give you something else to focus on. I mean, rather than beat you up with monotony and the same thing over and over again, small tweaks, which really don't change the outcome of the workout, can make you more engaged and just give you a little more, just investment. I mean, just keep you in it.
Keep you in it.
Going back to the beginning of what you said here on this, Chad, the key is to do more of it. And if you do more of it, it will get easier. We always suck at things we don't do, right? So if you do more of it, and these are some tips, obviously, to do more of it there.
And if you've never done any of this, there is a benefit there to be garnered. So give it a shot.
We're going to do 2 more questions, and then we'll cut out here. First one says, when I see my heart rate, and this really isn't a question but a point, when I see my heart rate get too high too fast, I psych myself out and perform worse. Yes. That happens a lot. And so many of you, it's a pet peeve of mine, they go onto Strava and get mad at me when I don't have heart rate data. Well, that's why. Because a lot of the time I look at it and it psychs me out. I just don't need it because I want to focus on performance.
I never look at it. I always collect it, though.
Sure. Yep. So in a recent crit, I struggled with the effort to hold a break and drop back to the bunch. The following week, I did a bunch of high-intensity interval training workouts in low volume, and I found I can hold now a higher heart rate in zone 4, he says. So he says, is the ability to work harder harder than expected, or than the expected benefit of, forgive me, I'm reading this one wrong. Is the ability to work harder the expected benefit of doing high intensity training? Or is it more likely to have been the higher volume done 3 weeks ago? So I guess that what you're getting at here is you got dropped off the front and it was in a breakaway. So chances are it's over under sort of efforts. That's usually what breakaways are. And then you did a bunch of high intensity interval training and low volume stuff that you tacked on with that. And then you feel like you're better at it now after. Part of it, yes. And those sort of things, it doesn't take long to sharpen the blade for some sort of athletes. And you can get that to come around. But like you said, could it have been the higher volume done you did 3 weeks ago? You may have let your body recover from that strain that you had coming in. It could be both of those
I think
options.
both, right?
Either.
Probably.
Yeah. And I found that when I'm not fresh, that's what really suffers, is the sharp point of the blade.
Oh,
right?
yeah. That's how it works.
I can still do a lot of endurance sort of work, right? And I can still carry that. But when I'm not fresh, it's the snap, it's the high end sort of stuff that suffers. So that would be one that I would expect. Let's see. Okay. Somebody says, here's a nice lame question. Probably not. I stumbled onto you guys randomly on YouTube, but I always feel like I'm interrupting the conversation. Is there some place where I can get in or get the intro to TrainerRoad.com or to TrainerRoad? Yeah. I mean, honestly, TrainerRoad.com is the best spot, but if you go to the forum, that's probably, I would say, maybe even in a better spot, because then you can talk to folks about that very thing.
And find the things you're looking for, right? Like on the forum, there's something for everybody. And there's a smattering of topics that we all have our favorites. And find something that you're interested in and learn about it on the forum.
Yep. I think it's a good spot to be. With that, thanks everybody for joining us. Remember, you can submit those questions and please keep doing so. They're awesome. I read through every one of them. You can do so at trainerroad.com/podcast and you can check it out there. You can also head over, like I said, to forum.trainerroad.com. And if you're interested in what we're doing, for example, we have the outside workouts beta that you can be testing right now. It's pretty exciting stuff. You can push those workouts automatically to your Garmin head unit, which is awesome. If you don't have a Garmin head unit, we're working on Wahoo right now. And then outside of that, you can also just get the power targets and like a normal coaching situation, write them down. You can reference it on your phone with the app. You can see it that way or commit it to memory. Or if you don't even have a power meter and you still want to train outside, you can do this and then you'll get RPE targets. You just click RPE instead of power and you can get it. So you can train outside year round. It's pretty awesome, man. And you can get the high quality structured training that you need. If you want to find out about features like that and many more things that we're creating, head over to TrainerRoad.com, and we appreciate all of you listening and trusting us with your training. That's really the goal here. So we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Guys.